else. Gang, welcome, 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 one and all, to yet another episode of Wick TV, a cross-ideological space where we come together to talk about issues both political and cultural, from the silly to the serious. And gang, have we got a show for you tonight. Recently, there has been a few reports from the New York Times and other institutions about Alito's house flying an upside-down American flag right after the January 6th insurrection. In 2023, it's recently been reported, he allegedly, from his beach house, flew uh, a Christmas tree flag. I'm not sure what to call it exactly, right?
The pine tree flag is its name.
A pine tree flag. And Democrats in the Senate, amongst others, have called for him to recuse himself, claiming that this is signaling that he is prejudiced, that he prejudiced towards Trump, to be clear, right? Not racist, right? But also that he cannot be unbiased when it comes to the court cases on stealing the election, etc. I disagree with this, and I disagree very strongly. And I've invited Josiah and Akata Boy to talk about it with me. Lactoid here will be backing me up. But with that, let's get into opening statements. I'll start, and then we will end with Akana Boy, and we'll just kind of go snake. So, when it comes down to it, there is no precedent for Alito to recuse himself. If anyone here thought Alito was an unbiased actor before this incident, they were living under a rock. We all know, that one of the reasons justices of the Supreme Court are chosen is because of their political leanings. This is a feature, not a bug. Now, some would argue that they should be unbiased, that they should recuse themselves if there's any hint of impropriety. But we have instance after instance of Democratic Supreme Court justices, right? Not recusing themselves after making statements showing that their political leanings are biased as well. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, famously, during the 2016 election, said that Trump was a faker, that if Trump was elected, she was going to move to New Zealand. She never did. No Democrats were calling for her to recuse herself. She also said that it was wild that Trump hadn't yet released his taxes. And yet, no one called for her to recuse herself when she was sitting on a Supreme Court hearing involving his taxes. This double standard cannot stand. Look, I'm a Democrat. I'm voting Biden, but I believe in our institutions. And while I'm open to reform towards the Supreme Court, I think that the naked partisan nature of this is a cure that is worse than the disease. And I'll end it there. Josiah, go ahead. What you got?
Cool. Josiah with Pondering Politics, YouTube political commentary channel. I think that Alito's flag scandal, it is a scandal. It's a disgrace. It's a further sign of the increasing and naked partisanship of the United States Supreme Court. It's certainly not only on the part of the conservative justices. The court as an institution is eroding in terms of public trust. Their approval rating is in the toilet. And we need to impose reforms on the court, not just the conservative justices. This is one such example, though. The founding fathers, to the extent you care about them at all, they expected the judiciary to be the weakest of the branches, the least active of the branches, and the branch that was held to the highest ethical standards, more than the president, more than Congress, because they didn't have any of the political burdens. You didn't have to worry about election, re-election, term limits, et cetera, and so forth. And so basically, to be super reductive, you're supposed to be an impartial android who comes out occasionally and otherwise fucks off. That's not what the Supreme Court is. And if they're going to act like a political branch, we have the right to impose political burdens on them, like political reform. Checks and balances go both ways. It's not the Supreme Court who can merely impose its will on the other two branches. The other two branches have the right, and I would argue responsibility, to impose their will on the Supreme Court. And so I do support major structural reforms to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's me.
Okay, we'll get into it as we go. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to a robust discussion. Lactoid TV, what do you got for us, sir?
Yeah, so all lawyers and justices and judges and all of that good stuff are still citizens of the United States of America and are still have the ability to have freedom of expression. So there's been case law on this. You don't give up your First Amendment protections just because you happen to hold a job, especially when it's not at your job. Oh, so if Alito was the one that hung the flag upside down, he has the right to do so. He has the right to have an opinion, just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg has the right to have an opinion. I'm sure all the justices have personal opinions about politics. I mean, they're human beings. They're legal-minded human beings, so of course they're going to have personal positions about politics. It would be completely unreasonable to expect that people don't have personal positions on politics just because they happen to go into the law. Um, no, so the second flag, the appeal to heaven one, kind of same argument there. My understanding is Mike Johnson also has one of those flags hanging outside of his office. It's unclear who hung that flag up. It may have also been Alito's wife, but regardless, again, that flag's been in use for a very long time. Like all flags, like the American flag, there's different things that you can take from it. But ultimately, I don't think that this rises to any kind of level where we should be concerned, and especially doesn't rise to a level where there should be some kind of obligation on Alito to recuse himself. Now, all of that is, I think, solid ground, but it's even dumber than that, though, the accusations against him, at least as according to the first flag, because he's not even the one that put it up. His wife did. So the accusation now appears to be that his wife is unable to have her own political opinions because Samuel Alito, is on the Supreme Court. That's just ridiculous. When it turned out that his wife was the one who hung the flag, that should have been the end right there.
Okay, thank you for being here. I'm sure we'll get into it as we go. And yeah, last but certainly not least, Econo Boy, thank you. What you got?
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. It's Akano Boy. I do economics and politics on YouTube, and I'm an esteemed host of the Three Wonks podcast. My general opinion on this issue, I kind of actually lean a little bit ironically towards Wick's position, which is that, in part, I almost like that Alito's done this because it exposes the Supreme Court for the partisan actors that they really are, right? That, we continue less and less each year, luckily, to play this game of pretend that Supreme Court justices are anything but conservatives and liberals who are doing conservative and liberal things. I think that all the criticism that we might have of liberal justices doing the same thing, making partisan statements. To be fair, I honestly, this might just be my media echo chamber. I do tend to hear about gift scandals more from conservative justices. I wouldn't be surprised if liberal justices had similar scandals. But the point is that they're all scandals, right? And it's not good that Supreme Court justices are doing this insofar as we play the game of pretend that they're not partisan actors. Now, to my partner's point in this debate, to Josiah's point, obviously, I think that there's many different ways that you can regulate a supreme judicial body in a country. We've run thousands and thousands of different experiments. Josiah likes to mention the state level sort of Supreme Court experiments where they have different models of running their supreme judicial body, and it seems like there are pretty good ways to solve the problem of Supreme Court justice impropriety or equivalent sort of court justice impropriety, while also maintaining institutional confidence. In the United Kingdom, they have a Supreme Court. In Canada, they have a Supreme Court. It doesn't seem like it's generally a forever and always controversial, polarizing issue. Who gets on the court? The actions of the Supreme Court. Of course, it sprouts up here and there. Of course, there's a controversial decision here and there, but it's not a fixture of their politic, as it seems to be in America. And I think that points to some real problems with how the founders and how we've applied the sort of founders' original framework for the Supreme Court today. I think it calls for ethics reform. I think it calls for structure reform. I think that I think those things are all pretty reasonable because if we believe in the institution of the Supreme Court and we believe in democracy, we have to have institutions that people trust, right? That people have faith in. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court's actions and the political actions and maneuvering around the Supreme Court have led to an environment where a lot of people, I think rightly, have a lot less confidence in the Supreme Court than they should, given the fact that, it's the Supreme Court. You should probably take that institution pretty seriously, right?
Okay, well, thank you for being here. And with that, we'll kind of open it up for discussion. I guess my first question to both Econo Boy and Josiah would be that given the fact, and it is a fact, that the Supreme Court is in the toilet when it comes to consumer confidence or the citizens' confidence. Do you think that any reforms that are crafted would be something that the citizens could have any confidence in at all? Like, it's not just the Supreme Court, but almost every institution across the board
Mhm.
is suffering from this confidence of crisis. So, any kind of reform or ethical kind of requirements that are crafted and put on the Supreme Court are going to suffer from this same crisis of confidence. I don't think the fact that there are um, partisans on the Supreme Court is a cause of this lack of confidence. I think that there's another root issue, and I think that any kind of crafted reform um, risks suffering that
Yep.
same issue of it will be just seen as a weapon, a partisan tool to be used in each election season.
So you may
Thoughts?
So
be
I
right. I was going to say real quick, you
Yep.
may be right, Wick, but this goes back to the long issue that you and I have on a lot of things, which is that things aren't good now. And it seems like anytime somebody proposes changing these things in good faith or thoughtfully, you come back with there's a risk. And of course, there's a risk. But the alternative is the status quo. And the status quo is clearly not working. Judicial experts, former judges, ethics experts, people have been complaining about the situation with Alito. It's not just soy libtards such as myself. So there are people who have much more experience than, even with all due respect, Lactoid, people who know the law better than Lactoid, who have more experience than Lactoid. There are people who also say that there are issues with the United States Supreme Court, and not even just the conservatives, also the liberals, as you point out. And this idea that we can't change anything because it may make it worse, I think that's a good argument for changing things carefully, thoughtfully, strategically, not taking a wrecking ball to it. But the entire point of the Constitution is the spirit of change. We amend the framers in their wisdom. If you're an originalist, if you're somebody who's a conservative who values the founding fathers, they recognize they didn't have all the answers, and so they created a process by which things could change. The Supreme Court itself has changed over time. So I just reject the premise. We can talk about what reforms would be better than others, which reforms would be more thoughtful than others, but this idea that we can't do anything, that's a non-starter for me, and I
Well,
think it
that's
is for
not
a
my
lot of others
argument.
too.
Wait,
To
wait.
be clear,
Can
go
I
ahead.
jump? Okay, before we get into the general, before we start hiding in the forest instead of examining the trees, I would like to talk about
pine
reforms
trees.
too. Sure, because we can talk. There's some reforms that maybe we can come to some level of agreement on. But I mean, let me guys ask you like directly. If Samuel Alito's wife was the one who hung the flag upside down, why is this still being talked about? Why is it still in
So
the news that there was an upside down flag at their
Yeah,
house?
so I would say that I think it's reasonably so in the news in terms of why it's talked about. For instance, a lot of people criticize Trump transitively through the rhetoric of his children, right? People will say, "Look at Donald Trump Jr. saying crazy shit," look at Eric Trump saying crazy stuff, all these kind of relatives and stuff like that. Now, I think that people criticize, for instance, Clarence Thomas because his wife is a crazy election denier, right? And they say, you should recuse yourself from the court because your wife was some people go maybe a bit far and say an active participant in January 6th, but she clearly was peddling the same type of conspiracy theory to the people involved, not necessarily on the ground, but I mean, you could say Mark Meadows is on the ground involved in it, but as far as I'm aware, wasn't a participant in January 6th, of course. But um, I'll go back to what I heard a politician tell me once. It was a local politician where I live, and he went through this big rigmarole. He got in some sort of he didn't get into a scandal. He avoided a scandal, and he talked about the importance of avoiding the appearance of corruption. He said, "Yeah, I come from a pretty wealthy family, and my family happened to own a piece of land in the city, and this piece of land was eligible for some sort of state whatever like local tax break or something, and we went ahead and just sold the land, and we didn't take the tax break, even though we legally could have, because the appearance of corruption is pretty much as bad as being corrupt itself, at the very least, if you care about your institutional legitimacy as an office holder." And I think similarly, I've had similar conversations with my wife. I've flirted with the idea of running for little local offices here and there, and I've talked to my wife and said, look, it's not that you can't express your political opinions as they genuinely are held. It's just that it's something that you have to think about how it affects the broader family, how it might affect somebody
How
like
it
me
affects your
who's running.
election chances, to be clear,
Well,
right?
election chances,
That's
but
what it's
also in the
about. at the
Right,
end
but
of the
also
day.
in the case of a Supreme Court justice, right? If you have a spouse who is a crazy election denier and thinks that the election was stolen, I mean, that's your God-given right to marry anybody, no matter how crazy they are, right? So I'm not going to disagree with that. He loves who he loves. But at the same time, I think it's fair for people to say, I mean, if one of our Supreme Court justices, in fact, two of them apparently are married to election deniers, it's kind of scary, right? Like that's kind of a signal that would lead to, most people don't get married to people with diametrically opposing political views. And so it's a little bit scary that that's the case.
And may I add to this before Lactoid and Wick respond, just to
I
put a
got to
button
respond to
in-
this.
Yeah, but just a button in this. Federal law and the Supreme Court Code of Conduct, which Chief Justice Roberts released towards the end of last year after months of pressure from Senate Democrats, require the justices to behave themselves in a way which avoids even the appearance of impropriety. So I'm not saying that certain people don't have the right to do certain things, but the fact of the matter is, it is an expectation that when you are a United States Supreme Court justice, you don't have the privilege to behave in an openly partisan way. That is the expectation. That's been the expectation since 1789, and it would be foolish to pretend otherwise. Otherwise, the U.S. Supreme Court Code of Conduct and I think it's 28 U.S. Code subsection 250 or 255, which calls for recusal if a reasonable person can question a judge's impartiality. These expectations are ingrained. They aren't just average Joes, and they can't behave just like average Joes.
Okay, a couple
Ridiculous.
things. First of all, nothing in that requires that justices are not allowed to express personal political opinions outside of the court. They're perfectly able to do so. There's obviously, that's different than letting those opinions influence the legal reasoning that you use. And I think that Alito is actually particularly good at crafting legal decisions that are based on an actual framework, right? Based on an actual analysis of legal history, as opposed to the cases that don't, aka Roe versus Wade and Obergefell. But this other standard now where we're going to start criticizing politicians because of the actions of their children, right? Trump is being criticized transitively through his children, that was brought up, or Clarence Thomas because of his wife. You guys are just straight up justifying like the criticism of Biden then because of Hunter Biden. Now, I actually don't criticize Biden because of Hunter Biden, outside of maybe some jokes among friends, because it's not a serious point. Because despite the fact that Hunter Biden may be some kind of, have a problem with drugs and a problem with guns, just because he happens to like have those issues, that in of itself is actually not relevant to Biden's governance and how he does his job as president. Just like the opinions of Alito's wife is not important to determining how Samuel Alito does his job as the Supreme Court justice. It's not even, I mean, it's not even, it's arguable that even Alito's opinions himself decide how he does his legal reasoning. But his wife, now we're so far beyond the pale when it comes to deciding, like, oh, look, his wife happens to hold some political opinions. Therefore, now he might let his wife's political opinions, like, if this was a woman, I don't think that you guys would tolerate this, right? Like, oh, she's married to this political guy. Maybe she's going to listen to her husband. We can't trust her. No, this is bullshit.
Well,
No,
I'm not saying that it's well, really quick. Like, I'm not saying that it's always legitimate to criticize a politician. And to be fair, I thought Supreme Court justices weren't politicians, right? They're supposed to be above that, right? So I wouldn't necessarily refer to them as politicians, but I wouldn't think that Supreme Court justices are like completely insulated from criticism of the actions of their family. Just like how I wouldn't say the same thing about any liberal on the Supreme Court or Joe Biden himself or anything like that. I think the problem that most people have when conservatives, especially like your MTG, like Lauren Boebert types, criticize Joe Biden transitively through Hunter Biden, is that it's often very surface level things that people shouldn't be criticized for. Oh, he was a drug addict. Oh, he took a dick picture that got leaked. Like these are. I mean, if Samuel Alito's taking dick pictures and doing crack, I mean that's a problem, obviously.
She
But
hung
I
a
wouldn't
flag
really.
upside down.
I understand, but obviously that represents, essentially a signal towards the
It could.
January.
It-
Well,
It
sure. Like,
could, compared to
We're
doing
doing some
crack
mind
and
reading, if I
gun
may.
smuggling.
Yeah, like we're
well,
doing this mind reading thing, this dog whistle thing, this okay symbol thing that some on the left love to do, right? And I would also take into account like it's interesting to see when people bring up these concerns. When, again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg talks a lot of shit about Trump, no one says boo. And again, this is her directly expressing her opinions on the president of the United States in matters regarding actual court cases she is sitting on. No one says shit. But when we do this partisan hackery thing where we only pick on our enemies and we don't hold ourselves to the same standard, it comes off as politicizing the court, unironically. And that is a problem. Again, I'm a Democrat. I'm a progressive. And just so everyone knows, I do get a check from Progressive Victory. My counterpart Josiah does as well. But we, as you
I
can see,
don't. Never
don't
will.
agree on. Yeah, don't agree on this. I think that if we want to repair the lack of confidence that the citizenry has in the Supreme Court, it's something we have to do with a holistic approach. One of the things we have to stop doing is stop threatening to pack the courts or do these other kind of very naked partisan reforms, right?
But
Now, I'm
but
with
Vic,
you.
Yeah,
the
I'm
problem. Hold on,
Yeah,
really
just real
quick. The
quick, if I may
problem.
finish, and then
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can
Go
go.
on.
You can finish. I'm
Go on.
with you. I'm okay with certain reforms. There is a reform package that you could craft that'd be like, okay, this makes sense. I think we should go for it. There's been some talk of rotating 18-year term limits and things like that I could get behind, right? But what's being called for now, currently, is for Alito to recuse himself. So I guess I'd just ask you both directly before you
Yeah.
respond. Do you think Alito should recuse himself from sitting on any court case involving Trump and the insurrection?
Yeah,
yes.
so I would say that for ethical reasons, yes, that you should recuse yourself because I think certainly there's an appearance of bias here. But I would also say, I hope every conservative justice recuses themselves from every court case. That'd be great. Our country would be great if they did that. But obviously, I can't justify it in ethical terms. But obviously, we need to hold our court justices to a decent sort of ethical standard. The reason I say that what Wick said was a little bit ridiculous, if you ask me, is that the reason why the Supreme Court's institutional confidence has been so low for these last several years is because of naked partisan actions by conservatives, right? I mean, there's a reason why a record high amount of Americans, in a question that's been polled in fundamentally the same way for the last 30 years, have said that the Supreme Court is too conservative, right? It's because obviously the Supreme Court's been packed with conservatives, right? Now, if Democrats want to come in and say,
Hold
I
on,
want to
wait.
pack the
Are you
court.
saying
Can,
the
can either of you
poll?
name one action, like one case, which was naked conservative partisanship?
Well, what do you mean naked conservative partisan? I can point you to cases that are conservative, sort of conservatively decided in nature. I'm not sure what
No,
you
no,
mean.
no. So you both just said like one of the reasons for the declining respect for this is because of this naked conservative partisanship. I'm pretty sure those were your words. Can you point to me any example of the court making a decision based on naked conservative partisanship?
We can point you to examples of court cases that have conservative outcomes from a conservative supermajority. But again, here's the problem for you.
Is that
I don't
conservative
have to prove,
partisanship?
here's the problem for you. This is your problem. Nowhere do I have to prove Alito's partisanship. I can cite you the Supreme Court Code of Conduct and U.S. federal law that says where their impartiality might be questioned. Lactoid, you're a lawyer, you should know this. I don't have to prove shit. I just have to reasonably question.
Look, the conservatives
No, no,
question
no, wait.
liberal
You got to
systems
prove. You got to
all the
prove.
time.
Yeah,
No,
you
I
got to.
don't.
Well, hold on. You do got to
I
prove.
have
Hold on. You got to prove something to even be able to question, the bias that somebody might be implementing in a legal setting. This is why I asked you. Can you point to any example in law, in their actual job, of any kind of bias or any kind of naked conservative partisanship?
We can point to conservative outcomes from a conservative majority, and in this particular case, right now,
Name
the
one.
reason
Not
that, well, the
enough.
reason that we're at that I can't speak for Econoboy, but the reason that I think that Alito should recuse himself is because right now they're deciding Trump's immunity case directly involving his attempts to steal the election from President Biden, and so if he is sympathetic to the Stop the Steal movement, or if his household is, there is a reasonable question that he would not be an impartial jurist on this matter. And again, going real quick back to Wick here, because that was my response to him. And Wick, you said about the flagrant partisanship of reforms. What reforms am I recommending or Econoboy
Well,
recommending?
not
That's
you,
partisan.
but I have one up from someone who has responded to your vibe check, right? That I want to read
Sure.
out, right? And I think this is
Okay.
indicative
Okay.
of many on the left. I'm not accusing either you, right? Either
Let's do
you
it.
or Econoboy of making these, but there are
Sure.
plenty who are pushing for these kinds of reforms, and I'll just read them. The court has operated with near unchecked power and is the centerpiece of what has become a multi-generational plan to subvert democracy in the United States by radical conservatives. The current crop of justices should be removed, new safeguards put into place. They don't define what that is. And the court's role redefined in the way the framers failed to do so during the Constitutional Convention, so it may never be weaponized so effectively again. So what they are calling for in this case is the removal of every single sitting judge. I
Well,
think that's fairly
That's not a reform,
extreme.
though.
well,
That's not a
yeah.
reform.
I think Wick. To be fair, I think that there
And
are
I do have
certain.
some super chats I want to get to. So, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. I think generally speaking, as a sanity test, I think that there are certainly things that the Supreme Court, if they theoretically decided, we would say, well, that's just such an insane ruling that there probably needs to be some extreme action taken. Now, in theory, we can say,
Give me
oh, what
an
if?
example.
Okay, in theory, what if the Supreme Court said Donald Trump's completely immune, the president's completely immune, they can do whatever they want, no legal consequences? Now, that's not exactly what the Supreme Court would rule, but if they did do that, I think we would say these people need to be removed from the court, right? That's such an insane opinion.
It
You're
depends on the
overthrowing
reasoning.
democracy.
Yeah,
No,
like Lactoid's
Lactoid,
saying,
it does.
It,
no,
it
no,
depends
listen,
on
you
the
guys,
reasoning.
if it's
you
the
guys are
law,
wild if you say
well,
that.
well, wait a minute.
What?
This is an Econoboy. I'm glad. See, Wick here will be the pivot point. I like Lactoid. He's a buddy. We're going to spar on this. But I actually, and he has impugned my motivations in the past. So we neither of us trust each other's
Because
motivations.
you're an admitted partisan.
Lactoid is fine with this configuration of the court because it has a majority which reliably delivers outcomes he wants. That's the reason. Like, for you to sit here and say that,
It's not true.
that the Supreme Court of the United States could confer absolute legal immunity to a single former president, Donald Trump, and you're open to it depending on their reason, that's absurd.
Wait. That's not true. That's not true. I can give you a direct example, right? This Supreme Court, which is one of the best in history, ruled that half of Oklahoma is ruled now or is under the jurisdiction of a ethno-state, right? The Native American tribes. I actually hate that outcome. I actually personally believe we should abolish all reservations, but it was the correct legal move because when you look at the reasoning that Gorsuch provides, when he actually goes through the legal process, it makes sense. It's the correct legal process. I don't. Hold on, real quick. Like an archaeologist, I don't just oh well, if you find this, you're never going to find this. Well, no. Let's see what actually gets turned up. Let's see what the reasoning is. If the opinion is well reasoned, maybe they could convince me. I don't think that's what the law means right now, right? But if they put forward good enough reasoning, then we have to accept it because it's a science, not like a partisan act.
Yeah, I want to add.
What do you mean it's a science?
It's originalism is a science. You're looking back through the legislative history to try to determine what the purpose of law
How hard is
is.
this particular science? Just out of curiosity, because that confers a certain type of meaning.
Like all science, there's a method that is applied as best as possible. It can be wrong, right, as we've seen in history, but at least they're trying to work through the method. When it comes to legal analysis, right, with the Dobbs decision, Alito went back and did a legal analysis of all the different states during the era of when abortion was being criminalized, and he cited all of those examples, and he cited the history leading up to Roe v. Wade and the problems with Roe v. Wade. It wasn't just
cherry pick. Didn't Clarence Thomas, in part of his analysis, also cherry pick certain parts of history as well? Wasn't that one of the major complaints about the? Okay. I'll have to brush up on my Dobbs.
The only reason I bring up that example. The only reason I bring up that example.
Thank you for the gifts of Admiral Gibbs.
Yeah, the only reason I bring up that example of that the Supreme Court could rule something that's so insane that we would say that it's incompatible with our current foundational morality or understanding of governance. I mean, it doesn't have to be like a particularly partisan example. What if the Supreme Court ruled that technically, I don't know, slavery was allowed or something? Let's just say, fuck the 14th Amendment, whatever. There's some weird technical mumbo jumbo. Slavery is allowed. I think that we would say we don't really care what your quote unquote internally sound legal reasoning is. You're impeached from the court. We've got to replace you. Now the only reason
I'm going to interject.
I reject that.
Yeah, because I think that
you think the Supreme Court could bring back slavery, and you'd say, "Well, the reasoning is sound."
So I have to answer.
No. Let me take this one,
that
please.
Sounds crazy
please. Right. The job of the Supreme Court is to interpret the law as it is as it currently exists.
There's no such thing,
right?
though.
So if they interpret the law in such a manner, and we don't like the outcome, say they do. Say, oh, hey, the way it's currently written, this insane shit is possible and
That's a
legal.
subjective
You know what
statement.
we do? We change the law. And we have a process to do that. What we don't do is to say we don't like what the decision you made, even though the reasoning was sound, and we are going to use this results-based kind of judgment thing
No,
to destroy the court, because
there is no.
You guys are
results-based
just
is not
results
as
based.
important
No,
as
that well,
process-based.
number
Process-based
one,
trumps results-based every time.
we
And can
we
I read
are.
the
Wick's
super
totally
chats?
right.
They paid me like
Well, let me
$30.
respond after you read the
Okay,
super chat. Then,
respond,
yeah.
and then you can read the super chats. I'll read the super chats after you respond. How's that?
Yeah, well, of course, first of all, the founding fathers were results based. They didn't say, yeah, this system's going to be complete dog shit, so we're going to implement it anyway because we have some internally sound reasoning. No, they said, hey, based on the environment that we lived in, based on the environment we grew up in, based on the environment we had to fight for, we're going to implement this governing structure because we think it's best for people. And because we don't think we're all knowing and all powerful and forever and ever, famous quote, Thomas Jefferson had this idea of, having a convention every so often because to have what was it, the quote, like to have a modern man ruled by a constitution 17 years ago or whatever is bad. We understand that the founding fathers were results oriented. They felt like they were developing a good system. And so in that sense, and especially when you frame it as there's this sort of known understanding of current law, no, there isn't. That's the role of the Supreme Court, is to understand and develop frameworks to deliver the law in a way that can be applied in a way that protects your rights, in a way that enforces those rights. And what I'm saying is that if the Supreme Court, and this is just a sanity check, clearly the sanity check has failed on half the panel, is that if the Supreme Court theoretically were to rule that slavery was okay, I think it would be perfectly reasonable for everyone in the government to say, these people are so crazy. It does not matter what their sound, internally consistent reasoning is. It's just simply not adherent to what we would understand to be basic moral fact, right?
This
And
is a
so
fun-
channel their Abraham
This is the
Lincoln.
results-based thinking, right?
Okay, let me read these super chats, because my results-based thinking here is I want you to give me more
that's
super
fair.
chats and continue to give me more super
That's
chats. So
fair.
give me money. $20 from
Understandable.
Cameraman 502. This is simply about delegitimizing the court, plain and simple, actively co-opting national symbols on behalf of extremists. In order to do that is dishonesty of highest order, admitting that you want all recusals proves it. Artemis Fowl for $10. Can we acknowledge that we have two people on the panel that will simultaneously demand Alito to recuse himself, but will be fine with the merchant's family directly profiting from his trial against Trump? Thank you for the $10. Okay, and with that, I want to pass the ball to Lactoid to respond to.
I think
the
there's. Well, hang on. Can we?
I-
Because the super chats were directed to Econo Boy and I. Can we address some of these?
Can you address them after I quickly respond to what was said by Econoboy?
I can read them again.
So what I'm hearing is very much a results-based argument, right? And now a justification of a results-based argument, which is, well, the founding fathers were also results-based. So but this is contradicted by what you just said prior when you said, the Supreme Court, they're there to interpret the Constitution, which I actually agree with. That's their role, right? What the Supreme Court says the Constitution is legally is what the Constitution says. They are the highest body of law. They are the decision makers when it comes to how the law is interpreted. And ultimately, if you don't like it, you can wage revolution against the United States Constitution.
That's not what I recommend.
But I'm saying, sure, you can do that, right? But the Constitution sets up the Supreme Court to interpret it. And when you're saying, well, sure, that's fine. But if they come up with a decision that I really don't like, I don't really care how they got there. I don't care about the legal framework they got there, because the founding fathers were, results oriented. This is, I think, the definition of naked partisanship. What you guys are presenting.
I'm arguing for
you guys
frameworks.
are presenting the frameworks don't matter. No, you're saying the frameworks don't matter. You want the results. You want the results that you want.
Congress has the ability to, really quick though, because I feel like there's this thought that the Democrats who are proposing these reforms are arguing for something that is like necessarily anti-institutional. Everything that everything that Josiah and I have been saying has been the idea that the confidence in the court is low. We want the confidence of the court to be high, right? We want people to trust in the Supreme Court. So at least from my perspective, what I'm recommending are things that I think would accomplish both a stronger and more stable Supreme Court that, is sort of generally representative of where the American people are at, and also a legal framework that would lead to a higher confidence in the court. For instance, in crazy example that where the Supreme Court legalizes slavery, and you guys just say, "Fuck, guys, that's just how it is. Supreme Court's pro-slavery. What are you going to do? I guess we got to pass a
That's
constitutional
not. That's
amendment
hold
again."
on. That's a
Hold
straw
on,
man of
listen.
what we're
It's a
saying.
straw
What we're
man.
saying
No,
is that we have
no,
other options. If it turns
yeah.
out that we have a framework, right, a legal framework that allows
No,
slavery,
but
we
the
should
the
change the
issue,
legal
Yes,
the
framework.
issue,
And
exactly.
the issue,
thank
the
God
whole
we have an
no, the
ability
issue
to
is
do that, and we
the issue
should.
is that the whole point. The whole point of what I'm saying is that the Constitution is a subjectively interpreted document. There is no true interpretation of the Constitution. So, for instance, we have a 14th Amendment. The whole point of the example is that we have a 14th Amendment that, in theory, got rid of slavery. That was like the whole point of it.
13th.
If we had 13th, sure. I guess 14th was the right to vote. If we had a Supreme Court justice or a Supreme Court broadly that said, well, we're going to just like interpret the Supreme Court, the 14th Amendment, in a completely insane way that leads to the nullification of the amendment effectively, and we can bring back slavery, well, that's obviously a court that's not operating on any sort of sound, well, it might be sound, but any sort of like reasonable legal framework that would be generally applicable to a broad understanding of that amendment. And
We'd
so
have
even
to
if we
see the
passed another
reasoning.
amendment,
We'd
it
have
wouldn't be good.
we'd have to see the reasoning to know whether or not it's reasonable.
No, okay, you're failing completely to engage in this hypothetical. and
No,
it's
no,
kind
no,
of
you don't.
annoying.
Even, no,
Obviously-
no, no. You're saying that like this result would be crazy. Obviously, they're not reasonable. And my point is, like with all things, I would need to see their reasoning. Maybe the reasoning is fine. I don't know what
Okay,
the reasoning would
wait,
be.
Why,
You-
why
you-
does
you
your
mentioned- you
approval of their
mentioned-
reasoning matter when you
No, but
just
really
said
quick,
the
no,
Supreme
'cause this
Court
is the
is
question-
the final arbiter of the
Josiah,
law?
this is the
should be
Because,
question.
no,
controlled.
because I'm the one on this debate panel, like talking about like my interpretation of what would be reasonable or not reasonable. I agree
Josiah,
with you
let-
that if the
Josiah.
Supreme Court came to like a through reasoning that I found to be errant, which I think a lot of cases, like Roe v. Wade, for example, was errant reasoning. But it doesn't matter. That's the law. And even though I didn't like that case, it was the law because the Supreme Court said it was the law.
So let's just say, for instance, that the Supreme Court did this crazy thing where they legalized slavery despite whatever the context of the amendments getting passed. And now, obviously, I'm making the absolutist statement, which is to say there's just like no legal reasoning that I would agree with that would do that. You're saying, well, there's some legal agreement that in theory is
But what
possible
would be the
that I
best
could come
path
to.
forward? Let's take.
But
your-
no, but
hold
really
on.
quick, hold on, because I just have to ask the last word of the question. Is let's say you disagreed with that ruling. You said this legal reasoning is crazy. I mean, you can't just
Yeah.
bring back slavery, right? Now, I suppose what you would say is, well, the Supreme Court, they made their decision. We're going to have to amend the Constitution again to
Yep.
like re-illegalize slavery. I would say we already did that, right? And also, the Constitution is subjectively interpreted. These are people who are tasked with a job to interpret the Constitution. They've done clearly a catastrophically bad job at doing that because now we can enslave black people again. So we should probably get new justices, or we should marginalize their voices by going through the legal frameworks to put people on the court that don't believe in bringing back slavery. And I don't think that's totally unreasonable. It's not even to say that that's a reasonable solvency for our current issues. But obviously, in theory, the Supreme Court would be able to do something so crazy that we would agree that this
If
is
you have a
perfectly
situation-
understandable to do.
If you have a situation where the Supreme Court is making these rulings and you think they are entirely unjust, entirely unreasonable, entirely things, which do you think is a more reasonable approach to, by fiat, just remove these judges by force?
That's not what I'm
Or
saying.
change the law? No, I'm asking you, which do you think
You
is
would need to
better
change-
to
you would
change
need-
the
I
law,
need to
which
change the
use
law in
force
order
to
to remove
remove
them.
these
In the scenario,
justices?
You would need to
to answer
change-
your question, to answer your question, in the scenario that I'm describing, what I would probably do is I would move to impeach the justices and pack the court with people that didn't believe that, because that's clearly an insane position. Those are both legal things that
So-
you can do.
Yeah, so
Like, I'm
Wick,
not talking about killing them.
yeah, so
I'm not
to
talking
add,
about killing. I'm talking about removing them, using force.
Well, by
to remove
force,
them.
What do
I'm
you
not
mean by
talking about
force?
throwing them in prison or
yeah,
something.
nobody's saying that go in and blackball.
What do you think? What do you think in like impeachment is? It's using the force
It's a
of the
legal
court.
mechanism. Well, it's a political mechanism enshrined in law. So the law allows Congress, by a simple
Certainly,
majority
but
in the
so is
House,
changing the
two-thirds.
Constitution.
Yes, and that requires 2/3 supermajority in both chambers and 3/4 of the states.
You would get
That's
that
not
if
gonna happen.
slavery. Hold on, you would get that to get rid of slavery definitively. If for some reason the legal
Listen,
reasoning
I don't know.
got
I
there,
feel like a lot of libertarians out there would be like, "Damn,
see,
that
what happens-
reasoning,
libertarians
though."
are the least in
if I
favor
will-
of
yeah.
slavery.
If
Slavery of any
if
political
this
group.
happens, right? Like if we normalize using fiat to remove the justices for things that we consider extreme
Wick, it's not
rulings,
fiat. So
what
that's what I'm saying.
happens?
Yeah, I don't
What
know what you mean by
happens
fiat.
It's
is
not fiat. So a couple of things. Can you just hang on? Let's really try to engage with one another in good faith. I'll do a better job. Please do a better job with me. It's not fiat. It's not force. Nobody would be black bagging justices. Right now, the composition of the Supreme Court is dictated by federal statute. Congress, with a majority, could change the statute and say instead of 9 judges, we could, because we have 12 circuits, we could bring it to, or 13 circuits, we could bring it to 13 justices. We could do more than that. The composition of the Supreme Court has been changed
You could
by
have
law
100.
in the past. You could have 100. You could have whatever,
You
right?
can make every citizen.
Hell
You
yeah.
could impeach. We're talk. You could impeach.
Base department? Hello?
You could impeach. And by the way, if you change the law that the Supreme Court rules against, the Supreme Court can strike it down too. So, like for example, Roe v. Wade, great example. The Dobbs decision struck down Roe v. Wade. Do you know what happens, or what in theory could happen, if we reelect President Biden, if we keep the Senate, if we take the House, and we pass federal abortion protections? Lactoid Supreme Court could strike it down again. Conservatives could judge shop, get it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, with a 6-3 conservative supermajority, could strike it down then. The only way to do something like that, just as that specific example, to protect abortion rights, you'd have to pass a constitutional amendment, because those are non-justiciable. That will never happen. So, and again, with all that in mind, none of that is fiat. I'll also remind you, the court was intended to be the weakest branch, not the big dick that smacks down the other two. And checks and balances goes both ways. This
They're
idea
equal
is
branches.
they're not equal. There's nowhere co-equal, equal. Find it. Control F. Find it in the Constitution. You will never find it.
Wait, does it describe them as lesser
Hamilton,
in the Constitution?
Hamilton and Madison both said in founding documents that it was to be the weakest and the least dangerous. They're not co-equal. Congress is the supreme branch.
cool. I don't listen to those people. I listen to the Constitution of the United States of fucking America. I don't care what those individual funders do.
I also real quick, I want to point out that, like you say, Congress is supposed to be the strongest one, but it's interesting then how when we're saying, well, change the law through Congress if you don't like the law, and you guys are saying, well, no, that'd be unreasonable. We should just get rid of the court if they don't decide the way we want them to.
Well, again, I'm not
Sorry,
saying
can you
that
repeat
that's
that?
reasonable.
I was looking at chat. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so you're saying Congress is supposed to be the strongest branch, right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, when we're saying, like, well, if you don't like the way the Supreme Court rules on like what the law means, get Congress to change the law, right? Because they're the strongest branch apparently. And that's what you guys have a problem with, right? If you're saying Congress should decide things, why were you in favor of Roe versus Wade when the Congress did not guarantee abortion nationwide?
Well, because I agree that Congress should have codified Roe protections. They tried to do so and couldn't make it past
Right,
the filibuster
But
threshold.
what I'm saying is the Congress can't do it, right? Because there's not enough support. But you're in favor of the Supreme Court just being able to do it.
The reason I am so against this, Josiah, and this is me being good faith as possible, is because growing up all my life, right, until the 2010s, 2008s, right, that period of time, right, when the court flipped or began to flip, I heard from my Republican friends and family, the courts are illegitimate. This has been the saying since I was born, right? The courts are illegitimate. They are destroying America. They're legislating from the bench. They are liberal hacks. They are Democrats in disguise. And if they had a mechanism, right, that they could use to just remove every liberal judge that they did not like, they would have used it in a heartbeat. What I worry about is when we normalize this, then we say, hey, this whatever decision you're making is super extreme. We don't like it. And so we're going to remove all the justices, that this will be a new weapon in the conservative arsenal to use against us. And I want to put a firm red line saying, no, we do not do this.
That's fine. So then what can we do? So that's fine. This is we're going to go back to the regular tension.
I'm
what
cool
can
for
we do?
some reform. Like I said, one of the reforms that I think is reasonable is having, I think it was an 18-year rotating term limits and grandfathering in the current justices, right? Because again, otherwise it looks like partisan hackery. You grandfather in the current justices, and then any justice going forward, you have 2 appointed each election, right, is what it will end up at, because you have this staggered 18-year-old thing. I can get you the details, but I think that's a great idea. So that way, no matter who's elected, they don't. It's not like Russian roulette on if they get to appoint any justices or not.
So
And so you
Wick,
can
can I ask you
point to
something?
yeah,
Like
please.
that's an example. You said the
Yes.
18. What's to stop? Because that would be some modification that could potentially break a conservative majority. The conservatives have been in the majority in the Supreme Court for the past 50 years. I am Josiah Republican now, and I'm like, Wick,
Wait, what?
I know
That's not true.
what?
The past
The
50?
conservatives have only recently been a majority in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, we haven't
Well,
had a liberal majority on the court since like the 70s. Yeah. So
yeah, whatever. I mean.
so getting back to what I was saying though. So let's say you propose your reform, Wick. Um, what if I, Josiah Republican, say, listen, that sounds all good and reasonable, but you're still screwing with the court, and so it's opening the door to further reforms. That you're concerned that there would be a bad faith response or a partisan response to any attempt to reform the court. Even with your reforms, there's still a risk of that, you know.
There's less of a risk, however, right?
Okay.
Risk mitigation is a thing, and the more extreme of an act you take, right? The more, and I know you
I
hate this
understand.
word,
So
right? So again, incrementalism. Look, I'm a big fan, and so incremental, slowly, steady reform, so that we aren't just like pushing on the gas pedal and sending that car like straight off the cliff. So if it turns out that there's some bad actors that try to mess with it, we can easily adjust.
But really quick,
Whereas more extreme things, it's
is
much
this a
harder.
is this like a misunderstanding of what Josiah and I are actually proposing? Like, I mean, if Josiah, you sent me your little list of reforms, which I essentially entirely agreed with. I don't, I'm just none of the things on like this general list of shit that we would want to do or like Democrats would want to do seems like particularly radical. The most radical thing, or like you could say the most blanketly partisan thing, is the idea of packing the court up to 13. Up to 11 is sort of necessarily less partisan. You could say that's also extremely partisan, but you know, we'd still have 6-5 majority in that case. Um, but I mean, the other stuff like gift reform, ethics reform, having an independent committee to screen nominees. I mean, these are. Does any of that sound insane
a
or like
No,
binding
I'd have
code
to
of
see the
ethics.
details.
How about a binding code of
I'd
ethics?
have
That'd
to
be a
see
big
the
one.
details. The devil will be in the details,
right?
but I'm not
The
in principle
yeah.
rejecting. What we're arguing about today, just to recenter us, right, is that both of you think that what Justice Alito has done is sufficient to call for his recusal, and I disagree.
Yeah.
And so that bears that calls into question, right? What kind of other reforms that you would find reasonable. So when you say things like mandatory retirement ages, compulsory ethics requirements, it makes me wonder, right, what these would be and cast into question your judgment. Because in my judgment, and I think the judgment of the legal system and the law, Alito has there's no precedent for him to recuse himself. There's no law requiring him to recuse himself. And the facts of the case show he probably shouldn't recuse himself. He didn't even fly the flag.
Well, I mean, as Josiah mentioned, the Supreme Court Code of Ethics seems to point to the idea that at the very least, it's the spirit of the code. I mean, of course, there's not going to be a line that says justices are not allowed to express any political opinions, right? But I would say that generally speaking, and again, this is the spirit of just general government ethics and sort of public ethics, in my experience, that you should do every single thing in your power to avoid the appearance of corruption. And in the case of the Supreme Court, because we do play the pretend game that these aren't partisan actors, to avoid the appearance of partisanship. Now, I mean, obviously, Wick, to your point of, well, RBG said Trump was a faker, and she had these sort of generic criticisms of Trump when he was a nominee in 2016. Now, I could be wrong. I just simply don't recall sort of harsh criticism. And to be fair, I don't think Alito does this openly. I don't hear Alito giving a bunch of speeches of like Biden's dog shit. I hate him. But I think when Trump took office, I don't think that the liberal justices broadly were like, "Yeah, Trump is terrible. We hate him, and we're going to rule against everything." And Alito hasn't done that either.
Ginsburg threatened to
But
move to New Zealand.
no, I understand. But was that while Trump was in office?
No,
I mean,
no.
that's kind
While
of the
while
whole
while he
point.
was running, she was talking smack the whole time,
No,
and
I
threatened to
understand,
move to
right?
New
But that's
Zealand. Right?
right. But again,
More
according to
importantly,
you guys, well, again, like it seems like the general opinion of you guys is that justices can have partisan opinions, right?
Yes.
It's just a matter of
I don't
whether or
think
not.
she
Anybody
should have
can.
been recused herself. I agree
Right,
with you. I don't think Ruth Bader Ginsburg should have been required to recuse herself. I
right,
think
and
what she said was
yeah,
perfectly okay. And in the
but you
same
guys,
manner, I think Alito's
Alito's
wife, to be
wife.
clear, flying a flag. But even if Alito himself had flied the flag, I think that again, much in the
yeah.
same thing, he shouldn't be required to recuse himself
Well,
either.
for instance, though, like I feel like there's a difference. Number one, in degree and also in magnitude, or let's say in kind and also in magnitude between the two. Like for instance, if a conservative justice came out and were to say, "Yeah, I mean, I think Biden's going to be kind of a disaster or whatever," I mean, yeah, like that would annoy me because again, it just plays into this general like bullshittery of like these aren't partisan actors, but it's like they clearly are. Just here's another quote to add to the fucking stack. But I don't think I would say that they should recuse themselves on all things having to do with Biden, right? And I'm not going to say that about liberal justices either. However, for a conservative justice to come out and seemingly as a family, because it was actually the wife. We don't actually know if that's true. We're kind of blaming it on the wife, but let's just say that that's true, right? To say, oh well, signal support of this idea of literally overthrowing an election result, and to have a conservative justice's wife do the same exact thing, I would say that that's quite a different magnitude of thing, and it's very specific in the sense that there's not like generic, oh, Trump is Trump kind of a disaster as president is not like a question that the court is ruling on, but all these election cases, I mean, that's something that the court is directly ruling on,
Yeah,
right?
there's a
So
greater degree of specificity. Sorry, I was fact checking myself, and yes, I stand by that the beginning of the Warren Court was the beginning of the
Mhm.
conservative
Fair enough.
age of
So
conservative.
you're calling the Obergefell, the people who like ruled gay marriage, that's a conservative court in your mind?
Lactoid. So let's try to engage in good
Well,
faith.
I just want to answer to
Let
that.
me,
Is
can, I-
that a conservative answer that question?
that is the beginning of a conservative court. That is not to
Gotcha.
say that every conservative court or every liberal majority results in exclusively partisan outcomes, which was never my claim. All right.
So
Now,
what my claim
so
is that the idea, and I've always been against this, the idea of putting justices in conservative or
Oh, and
liberal,
I got more super
yeah,
chats. So
conservative and
just so I
liberal,
can respond, but then I'll
conservative and liberal is something I've always opposed, right? In legal philosophy, and this is something that you learn in law school, right? It's not actually about liberal and conservative. It's about originalist and other forms of legal theory, like living constitution theory, certain types of textualism, etc. And there's a lot of disagreement. Just recently, we had Justice Thomas author an opinion with the three, liberal quote unquote
yep,
justices against Alito and against Gorsuch. We see these disagreements not
Louisiana voting maps, right?
we see these disagreements because they're attempting, at least the originalist ones are, or the ones that are adhering to an actual philosophy as opposed to just we want what we want partisanly. Though they're actually
I think
trying,
you're a
they're
little
trying.
biased here, but go ahead.
Well, I'm not biased. I already listed out the examples where I think originalism actually doesn't serve me well. But it still makes the most sense as like in the what the purpose of the Supreme Court was and the actual legal reasoning that is done. Originalists write longer opinions. They write opinions that are more have more citations. They write opinions that are more likely to disagree with one another because they're actually trying to get to some kind of legal truth as opposed to this sort of lockstep partisan. I actually think it might be fair to call a certain legal element liberal if their living constitution theory is just, well, we want to get done what we want to get done. Obergefell is not based in historic U.S. law. It's just not. Roe v. Wade is even worse. Roe v. Wade's terrible. That was motivated by partisan logic. There's no other explanation. Even Bernie Sanders didn't like that case.
So
I mean, no matter what you say, the reforms that we advocate for, I mean, are sort of they don't really attempt to change foundationally the legal scholarship or like the legal frameworks that people use, right? It's just a matter of, well, do you take gifts from certain people? What are the exacting rules of recusal? Like just having more specificity
yeah,
in that regard would be good. Like,
let's get
I
to
mean,
brass tacks. I don't even know why we're so. Again, Wick gave an example with the 18-year rotation. Okay, Lactoid, are there any reforms that you would entertain to the United States Supreme Court?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would have to see the
Sure.
specifics on the ethical code.
Yeah,
But
just ballpark it for me.
sure,
Just
yeah, yes.
ballpark
So
it, yeah.
with the specifics on the depending on the specifics, I could agree to an ethics code. I think that'd be fine. When I looked at the details of the proposal, it's not unreasonable if the Supreme Court would have some kind of independent counsel that would enforce it, that they would select. I think that's not unreasonable. The idea of having the 18-year thing, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. There would need to be a grandfathering in, of course. Otherwise, it's just a power grab. But if it's the partisanship of the future is unclear, and we just think this change would be healthy, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. One change that I know that you guys would be opposed to is I think that every justice should have to swear an oath to interpret the Constitution with the intent of how it was written. That should be a requirement. There should not be justices that have this kind of theory of the history doesn't matter.
Well, sure. I mean, we would disagree with that. I mean, I would disagree with
Can I
that
read
just
these super
because.
chats before you respond, though? Just
Yeah,
Sure.
sure. Wait, go for it.
money. $5 from Cameraman 502 to say, after subjecting the court to dishonest libel, Boy now wants to restore its legitimacy. Never mind how that happened or its clear partisan nature. Thank you for the $5. Five
no.
more dollars from Cameraman 502, your greatest fan here, apparently.
I love cameraman
The
502.
problem with avoiding the appearance of impropriety is pondering an Boy dishonestly impute impropriety like appeal to heaven flag. Thank you for $5.
Listen,
I
it's
mean,
it's a pretty
yeah.
high standard, but as far as I'm concerned, again, I can't speak for Boy. I'll own it. My position is, and again, you can cite all the examples you want. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been dead for 4 years. If you can cite an example where she talked shit about Trump in a specific way about like that's germane to a case, like the tax case, fine. She should have recused. I have no problem with that. My proposition is that the Supreme Court of the United States, like what I hear, the proposition that I'm currently presented with is insane. That you have 9 people appointed for life. They don't have to worry about elections, term limits, mandatory retirement ages, whatever. Their code of ethics, which is binding in every other tier, is not binding to them. It's just discretionary. If they, don't disclose certain things, they can just say, fuck it, sorry, forgot about it. They can fly flags, a Biden bumper sticker here, a Trump bumper sticker. We've got our First Amendment.
They can
right.
accept vacations.
We can
from
accept
partisan
vacations
actors.
from partisan actors, all these things.
Yeah.
We can strike down executive orders and federal statutes. We can fuck with the other branches whenever we want. All we have to do is just wait for somebody to judge shop it, make its way up through the appellate process. We grant cert and it's ours. And you can't do fuck all about it. That's insane. It's insane for a few reasons. Again, let's go back to the fathers. The Supreme Court was not intended to slap the other 2 branches around. The vast majority of governance was expected to be done by the legislature and the executive, and the Supreme Court was meant to be set aside. And in exchange for not having to go through an electoral process, they were supposed to be as close to androids as possible. Now, I agree, that's unreasonable. That was actually proof that the founders were not quite so brilliant, because it's impossible to expect people to be completely nonpartisan. I think even Lactoid would say, even though he certainly carries himself as I'm not partisan, he's not perfectly objective. But the standards should be higher. And if the standards are not going to be that high, and if you're going to flout the standards, then it's not unreasonable to impose additional requirements on the court. If you're going to act like a political body, you should be treated like a political body. No other advanced democracy on earth does it this way. None of the 50 states except Rhode Island. Wick, we talk about states being laboratories of democracy. 49 out of 50 do it differently than we do. Maybe we're not doing it right. Maybe we could do it better.
Do you agree with Marbury versus Madison?
In terms of them granting themselves judicial review?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's tough. I mean, it really is. It's tough. There are, judicial review exists in other countries, but it's watered down because the idea is legislative primacy. Like, I think the High Court in the United Kingdom, they can send laws back for basically, it's like for editing, but if the legislature wants to go through with it, they can. So it's tough. But here's the other thing, Lactoid, maybe you disagree. I don't have all the answers to this. I understand that there's no perfect outcome to this. It's this constant tension. I think judicial review is an incredibly powerful ability. And depending on how it can create a scenario where one branch becomes dominant over the other.
Okay.
And again, I think
2
checks
things.
and balances work both ways. Sorry.
2 things, because I have a couple responses to that. But first, $10 from Running Joke to say, nice to see the lefties crying about the SCOTUS now that they lost the majority. Thank you for the $10.
Wait a minute. Hey, Running Joke, you live up to your fucking name. We never had the majority. We haven't had no one here was born when we had the majority.
Go off,
These
King.
people, by the way, should jump into chat when we're done. Cameraman
I hope
included.
they will. I hope they
Please
will.
do.
I'm just saying, you guys didn't complain when, again, because
Well,
you guys are results oriented, when Roe v. Wade and Obergefell happened.
I
Well, I
wasn't
mean,
yeah,
alive
this is
for either of these.
sure, but
again,
Obergefell,
we're,
Obergefell was
Obergefell,
gay
you were.
marriage,
Yeah, that
right?
was
That
gay
was
marriage.
2015. Yeah,
yeah,
2015.
so
So
again, we're not
here's a
making the
if I may,
argument. Yeah,
your
sure.
side just had a good long portion. Let me respond a little bit, and then I'll
sure.
let you respond. Sure. So the I have problem is twofold, right?
Sure.
I think that when it comes to checks and balances, the Supreme Court, and at least in our American legal system, and I'm not talking about, I know other countries do it differently in other parts of the world, but at least in the system we currently have, is kind of necessary and I think kind of valuable. I agree that it can be dangerous and powerful and misused. I agree that we should probably look into some reforms. However, what I call into question is the timing of the call for reforms. It's never when you're getting your way, it's always when you're not. And that, when we talk about politicizing the courts, when we talk about decreasing trust in institutions, one of the reasons that we've seen a drastic, at least in recent years, of trust in the Supreme Court as well as other institutions is because of again, this impression that it is becoming more and more of a political battleground. And as we as a country are getting more and more polarized, there are other variables at play here, right? And
Mhm.
I worry that by opening this box, we are going to create this tit for tat race to the bottom that's going to be a problem. I understand that there's always a risk. Even of doing nothing, there's always a risk that the other side's going to get, but I'll be damned if I'll be the first to pull that trigger, right? I'll be damned if I couldn't. One of the things about me is I have to feel good about myself when I'm by myself, and I would be remiss if I'm the one to uh, add to this political partisan nature. I believe in processes. Okay. One of the things that the founding fathers did well, in order to try to get the results they wanted, they put into what they felt was the best practice processes to get to continuously good results on a consistent basis. And they recognized they wouldn't be perfect at it. So they added processes to adjust themselves so that people could move it around if mistakes were made. We have the ability to change the courts. That's true. But what we cannot do, and I'm not, again, I'm not talking to just you two here. I'm talking in general, and this goes for your side too, buddy, Lactoid, right? You're on my team right now, but y'all side do it too, right? In fact, I would argue more than our side does.
Do what?
Uh, they do this partisan hackery thing where when they're not getting their way, suddenly they want ethics reform, but when they are getting their way, they just ignore it entirely. And we need to stop on both sides, on all sides. We just need to stop that. We can look at it, but it has to be done in a way that is beyond reproach. And when we call for it, only in the case of things like Alito flying a fucking flag, it just doesn't pass the smell test to me. That's all.
Wick. So a couple of things. I'm determined we're gonna come to consensus here. We already got Lactoid to commit that he's gonna vote for President Biden this year. You and I are going to come to a consensus.
Look,
That's why
voting
he
for
got the
Biden.
fucking
I'm riding with
celebratory
Biden after.
motorcycle. Okay, you and I will get. We're gonna crack this.
Yeah, I got the motorcycle because gas prices are about to plummet.
Fuck you! Mute him. Fuck him. Fuck him. Okay, so listen. Here's where I'm struggling, and I don't know. Maybe Akana Boy doesn't share this. So you say you don't want to trigger a race to the bottom. I agree. You and I probably just have different standards. You say you don't want to increase the likelihood that the other side responds excessively. I agree. You also say, though, there's always a risk. What I'm trying to figure out is, couldn't I make the argument that anytime let's say we have a situation where we have a Democratic president and he confirms a nominee to the bench, couldn't I make the argument that that might risk a Republican bad faith response because the Democrat did anything? Like,
You
do
could make
you?
that argument, it just wouldn't be convincing to me. And I'll
So,
tell you why.
okay, please
Just
do.
real quick.
Yeah.
Because there is always political games that have been played, and they've been
Sure.
played for a long, long time. And this is one of these standard procedures that we have countless examples of this happening. And I think that that's okay. And it also, again, reflects the will of the people in a way, right? When your president is elected, presidential elections have consequences. And that's why I was very upset when a lot of people didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. We knew this was coming, right? This was an unfortunate thing. But what we again, we if we want to abide by the norms, right, the mores of our culture and our political culture, we can't feed the fire. Now, I understand that there's bad actors on the Republican side that do this. I do. I get it. But they get less power if we stand against them from a principled stance. There's one reason, right? Like, people hate hypocrisy. They just do across the board. Uh, if we can be principled on this, I think we have a better chance of winning elections in 2024, especially. And that is going to, going into the future, help decide the Supreme Court. Whether or not we can get reforms, politics is the art of the possible. Can we get these reforms in the current political climate? I don't think we can. I don't think we can. We need to win elections first. And one of the ways we do that is by drawing a clear, distinct line between us and them, the good actors and the bad actors. And if we can just draw that line, we will attract more voters. I honestly believe that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So again, what I come down to, I would argue again, this isn't a turn-based RPG. Republicans or conservatives don't have to wait for us to do anything before they respond. We saw that with certain things like, sorry, my phone went out. The blue slip veto for the Senate Judiciary Committee. Republicans came in, revoked the blue slip, which allowed Trump and the Republican majority to kind of cram their appointments through. They did that proactively. That wasn't in response to anything. They just saw an opportunity and took it. So you could just make the case that Democrats running for office at all could potentially trigger Republicans into reforming the court even more in their favor. Doing this idea that we can't. You say that there's things we can do and that there's elevated levels of risk. But the way I look at it is I don't know how you evaluate what carries greater risk. Why doesn't the 18-year reform, why doesn't that carry a meaningful risk of Republican overreach?
We don't hear this type
Go
of
ahead,
rhetoric
Nicola.
in like almost any other country, right? Like in the UK and Canada, the liberals in Canada don't say, well, if the liberals think big, that might cause the conservatives to think big, right? And it's a little bit frustrating because we live in a democracy, right? And and I understand what you're saying, Wick. You're saying, well, I'm motivated ultimately by winning elections, right? And I think that you guys' strategy will lose us elections by calling
Yes,
for
I
Supreme
do.
Court reform. Now, to be clear though, Wick, literally nothing that we just described. I think if you polled each individual thing, the most controversial thing would be adding justice to the court. Everything else, I believe, and Josiah, correct me if I'm wrong, polls pretty highly. Like the idea of establishing
Yes.
an ethics code, the idea of
Yes.
having independent judicial review. Now, here's the
Removed
thing,
from the
though.
context of when it's being done,
Well,
yes, but you can't
well,
remove it from the context of
well,
when it's being
the
done.
the question is asked at a certain time period, obviously, but I think that generally these ideas, I think it's generally popular the idea that insert government official needs to be held by an ethics code. I think that, like any person generally is pretty favorable with
There are
that.
some
And you can do
proposals that
just
are bipartisan, right? I think the ethics code specifically has
yeah,
majority Democrat and Republican
it,
support.
yeah, and
Why?
and
Well,
so
can I ask real quick? This is a great
yeah.
question. Why isn't it going anywhere?
My guess is there's probably an element of partisanship from the Republicans in Congress that's blocking some element of this.
Sure.
There's some ethical rules that I think are pretty common sense that I would like to see,
Yeah.
and because I'm not a partisan, I'm able just to accept that, even though it's justices
really,
that I mostly agree with.
That point right there, Wick. This actually, I think this goes to Boy's point. So yes, Supreme Court reform. I mean, obviously there are varying degrees of popularity depending on the policy proposal, but overwhelmingly the Supreme Court is unpopular and people want it changed. And most of these proposals have majority support. The reason it's not going
I'm not
anywhere
against that.
is because Republicans won't do anything with it because the court reliably delivers outcomes they like.
So it would
They
be
don't want
very
to change it.
nice if we could
Not
win more
reliably.
elections and vote them out. It would be very nice.
But
But
Wick,
then what
we're
happens when we vote them
disagreeing.
out? Then we
Yeah.
have to, then when we have power, we have to use it. And
Gotta do
this is
things
where
with
the
it.
constant tension comes in. because you would say, well, Josiah, if we use our power after we win elections to change the court, that risks the next time Republicans
No,
take power. Oh, okay.
no, no. I would say that there are certain ways of using our power that would do that, but there are other ways which would have a much lesser risk, and I would be fine with. Like I said, a bipartisan ethics reform bill. Again, devil's in the details here, but I'm not against that in concept. I'm not against that, right? Like in passing through, and I think we should. But the reason we can't is because we keep playing these partisan games. And so when we do get our majorities, you know what we do? We decide, well, now that we have power and can push on these levers, I don't know if we want these
Actually,
reforms
no. Actually, the
anymore.
problem is,
And both
I would
sides
beg
do
to
that
differ. No,
shit,
no,
and
no,
it's a
no.
problem.
That's the problem when it comes to the court. I beg to differ. I
So
beg
weird, though.
we've had legislative majorities by Democrats, and we haven't imposed our will on the Supreme Court. Do you know why? Because frustratingly, so many Democrats, an increasingly fewer number now, thank God, think like you, which is, even though we have the leverage now, we can't fuck with the court. Now, thankfully, thank God, we are starting to see that behavior. So, like, you know what? We've given them plenty of slack. We're going to be willing to impose.
They're moving
our
away
will
from
on
being
the court.
principled and more to being partisan. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well, just to be
appreciate that
clear,
last point.
Laxoy,
But
the Republicans, when they governed, had no principles with regards to how they managed Supreme Court seats. They literally contradicted their principles throughout the process of stacking the court in their favor. So, I mean, it's just, to Wick's point, I mean, obviously this happens on both sides. I'm just willing to concede that, look, when Democrats are in power, they should do Democratic shit. And that includes Supreme Court reform,
I'm
right? And well, really quick, just to finish the point, and if, to Wick's point, if that galvanized, like, for instance, when Obama passed Obamacare, that galvanized Republicans. It led to a huge swing in Congress that lasted 9 years, however long it took. It was like almost 8 years until the Democrats could win the House again. But what did Obamacare do? It gave tens of millions of people health care that they otherwise would not have gotten. And so
it's exactly how Lactoid would describe it,
right.
too.
Well, no, yeah. And so similarly, I think somebody in 2008, and many people did tell Obama this in 2008, you can't tackle healthcare. It's too controversial. We shouldn't pass this policy. And if they had listened to that, tens of millions of people would be in higher poverty than they are today, and they wouldn't have healthcare. And similarly, when we're talking about institutional reform of the court, I think when Democrats win elections, if they can win, none of the things we talked about are controversial. I don't think anything we talked about leads to less Democrats getting elected. That was the point of bringing up the polling. When Democrats win elections, when Democrats win, if they can get good Supreme Court justice reform done, I think that all that leads to is not like a bunch of Democrats losing elections, because I don't think what we're talking about is nearly as controversial as healthcare reform. It leads to just a better institutional framework for the Supreme Court.
Again, I want to repeat this. I'm not against us getting elected and passing good
This is
Supreme Court reform. I think that's great. Let's do it. My problem here is I doubt some people's principled stance on this, because they're calling for, let me just say this, in any Supreme Court justice reform that goes through, what I would be opposed to is it requiring a justice's family not to express their political opinions.
Right.
I think that would be a bad reform.
Yeah, if we're just talking about how like you guys want to win elections because you want Congress to be more aligned with you, and you're going to point to Congress people being partisan hacks, which, I mean, Congress is the place to be a partisan hack, right? That's the whole point. Sure, I mean that's like one conversation, but this conversation is about whether or not Samuel Alito, like within the court, should recuse himself because his wife hung a flag upside down in front of their house. This conversation is about whether the Supreme Court right now is like, what kind of rules should we have for that? What kind of rules make sense? Is the logic that the Supreme Court's going through like logical? And my argument is that it is. And this Supreme Court is actually like one of the best. You have examples of, well thought out opinions where you have, originalist and textualist justices disagreeing with one another. That's what we want to see. We want to see, even if the results are bad and I disagree with them on a political level, and I might support political reform to get what I want, which I often do, right? I think politically, the Oklahoma situation needs to be reverted ASAP, right? And then some stuff with the bathrooms as well. But that's not the case. But the reality is the Supreme Court rules that way. And they ruled that way through a process. And this idea of like, well, sure, all that process is fine and dandy, but his wife, though.
Well, Lactoid, are you under the assumption, really quick, are you under the assumption that someone's partisan alignment does not, like, are you under the assumption that, oh, well, my legal judicial philosophy comes original to me and is not influenced by my partisan leanings. I mean, certainly.
Here's a good way of explaining it, right? You could have an environmental scientist who's incredibly pro like Democrat, incredibly pro liberal, and they can write a like long dissertation on global warming. Just because they are liberals and they do have a political interest in preventing global warming does not mean that their paper is wrong. And in fact, if we look through the paper and the science is right, then it's right. Then look, the paper makes sense. The argument makes sense. In fact, their science could be wrong, but if it's based on evidence, if it's well thought out, I'm not going to question the validity of the paper just because the author happened to have political biases.
Well,
I mean,
sure, but
the Cato Institute, for example, is also very like has a political bias, but they're
Mhm.
consistently, reported as being an incredibly fair body in terms of reporting facts.
Well, you've kind of snuck in though. You've compared developing a judicial philosophy to the scientific method,
Yes, it
right?
is.
Now,
That's what I said at
obviously,
the beginning.
well, yeah, but that's obviously completely wrong. And obviously, when you're interpreting law, there's no objective right interpretation of law. The founding fathers disagreed on how to interpret the very documents that they helped
Hold
create,
on,
right? So,
Econo boy,
I
you
mean,
don't believe this, and I'll tell you why. Right?
okay,
You
tell
you
me why.
do you think that a
Yeah.
justice could, if they wanted to, a Supreme Court justice, do you think they would get away with this if they
hmm
said, you know what? I think the Constitution says I should be able to have 20 wives. And they
Okay.
don't cite any reasoning, and they just said, well, I'm a Supreme Court justice. I just believe it. Do you think that would
Okay.
go through? Do you think that would work?
Well, I mean, according to Lactoid, that is literally what the liberal justices are allowed to do. So, I mean, apparently it does work.
So wait a minute. So listen,
It would
I'm
work in one sense, but it would be incredibly irrational, and it wouldn't be based on the science of originalism. It wouldn't be based
yeah,
on
I
trying to look for logic to reach your conclusions.
Well,
this
the
is
only reason, really quick, Josiah, the only reason I bring up, and Josiah, obviously jump in after this, the only reason I bring that up is because I think that, again, there's this, I think there's this general presumption. To be fair, it's quite a popular thing to say. I mean, even Justice Jackson, when she was getting, I believe when she was getting questioned, she committed to the idea of originalists. She was like, no, we're all originalists, right? Which, we can quibble with whether or not that's truthful or whatever. Obviously, she's a liberal justice, but the only reason that I say that
I have
is
to use the
because
restroom real quick. Give me 1 second. Yeah, but
yeah, no
continue,
worries.
please.
The only reason that I say that is because I think that oftentimes we're under two completely like incoherent and devoid of evidence assumptions, which is that originalism and textualism is just like the right way to interpret law, when even the original founders who founded these things didn't necessarily always agree with how to interpret the powers of the federal government, the role of federal government, which is to say, obviously, it's very subjective. Even the original principles of the Constitution did not agree on these things. And then number two, I think we're under the assumption as well that someone's partisan leaning does not obviously, like Lactoid, you mentioned, well, somebody might be a conservative and also be originalist. And if they're using originalist principles to do conservative things, that's fine. That doesn't make it
Yeah.
partisan hackery. But what I'm saying is that I don't think that the Supreme Court are amoral robots. I think that what they're doing is they have a moral foundation. They have a partisan foundation. They say, I'm a conservative. I'm a conservative because of these reasons, religious reasons, upbringing reasons, whatever, just like my experience. And because of that, I tend myself towards originalism. And they might not say this, they might not even think this consciously, but because of that, they tend to rule in a way that's conservative, right? It seems ironic that the conservative justices tend to rule in a way that basically perfectly aligns with their political beliefs. I just don't think that's a coincidence.
It's not
right?
it's not a well, hold on. It can be a coincidence, right? Because you can have like there can be something similar among a political belief as
It
well
can be. I
as
just don't
as
think
well
it
as
is.
well.
Right?
So I would assert I think it is, right? Because like it also is a coincidence that like the most of the researchers that are involved in studying climate change may also be left wing, right? Is that a coincidence? I mean, it could be, right? It could actually be a coincidence because
Well,
the
the
because the
two
kind of
assumptions.
people, right? Because the kind of people who care about climate change, who care to like actually invest the time into researching it,
Right.
right? Like they could also be also the kind of people who vote left wing. But
But
what I'm
address
trying to
the
say
first
though,
assumption.
well, right, what I'm trying to say though is like with all things, with the environmental science, like with the justices and everything, this is why it's critically important to read the reasoning, right? So yes, like if a Supreme Court like justice like writes an opinion, I withhold judgment until like I read the opinion. Wick can attest to this, right? Like I try to read the opinion before I talk about an opinion when I come on, even if it's written by my favorite justice, right? Like I'm not going to jump on and defend Dobbs without reading it. I'm not going to jump on and say, well, Alito wrote it, therefore I know it's good. No, it could be an ass decision. It could be a complete shit decision. I want to look at the actual logic. And if the logic is like based in like the sort of the scientific method that I'm describing, then I'm going to say this is a good decision. And the justices that have a history of using the scientific method, I'm going to describe them as like the originalists, the scientists of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Whether what their personal political positions are is actually, that might again be correlated to their judicial philosophy, but it's largely irrelevant when we're trying to determine things like corruption. Right? You're not corrupt just because you have a political belief. Maybe if you're getting paid by somebody to rule in a particular way, that could be like maybe arguably corruption or have like the aura of corruption. And I think the ethics code should probably maybe focus on shit like that. I'm actually in favor of an ethics code that like prevents Supreme Court justices from getting.
Well, I think that's
gifts.
where we disagree, right? Is that I think that Josiah and I would say that all of these things are not just like happenstancely correlated. We would say that they're causal, right? That like somebody who's a conservative or like an ultra right wing conservative, let's say in the case of Alito, which is my of course my assumption, that person tends themselves towards a judicial philosophy that is like necessarily conservative leaning, and obviously we have this evidence that apparently Alito has a family that at least has a family who is at least sympathetic to the idea that an election was stolen.
How dare he, right? How
Well,
dare
but
he
the
have a
thing is-
family?
How
with a
dare
baby?
he get laid?
Oh my God!
But here's
what a
the thing, like
monster.
the thing is though, Wick, like I don't think it's unreasonable to expect an extremely high standard of conduct from Supreme Court justices. right?
Can we
But we're not
focus?
talking about the
can-
justice. We're talking
can-
about their family.
Can we so a couple of things. So let's focus on this. So again, Lactoid, I completely reject your analogy, your metaphor of the climate scientists. So for a few reasons. Number one, I don't think even you would dare say that climate science or any of the hard sciences are in the same universe as judicial interpretation, even if you consider it a science, that one is considerably harder and more objective than the other. Number one. Number two,
It's a comparison.
I understand, but well, no, they don't have to be identical
To make the comparison, right? They're not identical,
yeah,
but they are a comparison.
But they have to be similar enough. You say they're both science. You say they're both sciences, and you're talking about the author of certain papers, and you're suggesting that we would apply the same sort of scrutiny to one than the other. A couple of things. Number one, a climate scientist, when they're writing climate studies, they go through a rigorous peer review process. Okay, number one. Number two, the science in question is considerably more objective. Number three, they're not making outcomes in using judicial power and state power that imposes things on the rest of us. Okay, so I just reject the example every which way.
Those are the peripherals. Those aren't actually like the core principle of it. Is it like a method? Is it an actual scientific method? Is it based on some kind of, okay, we have this testable hypotheses. What was the purpose of the law? Are we going to test it? Like, how do we test it? Well, we're going to research. We're going to look into this.
I think it would be easier to separate the biases of the personal biases of a climate scientist from the work that they produce than a judge. And I think Econoboy would agree with that. I think Wick would agree with that. I think
Hold on, no,
you would
why?
agree with that.
Why are you saying that? I might, but why?
Because the science in question, because climate science in general is more objective and it has to go through a rigorous peer review process. So for if there is
come on, it's more objective that 1 + 1 = 2
know,
than whether or not
you know what the
Americans have a right to own a
reputation
gun.
crisis
Right? I
is?
mean,
Are you aware of
Wick,
what the
oh my
reputation
God, Wick.
crisis is?
Engage with that hypothetical. It's easier to understand that 1 + 1 = 2 than it is to understand.
course
I mean,
it
in an
is.
objective
But
sense.
that is not what he is talking about when he refers to climate change and the peer review process.
He's talking about
reducing
science.
something to something that's obviously true. When we talk about the peer review process in the scientific community and the journals and all these things, there are incident after incident after incident after incident of people flagrantly plagiarizing their work, right? Making shit up on data that peer
Okay.
review hasn't caught. Like when we talk about this rigorous peer review
So,
process, first of
right,
all, we got some problems right off the bat there. We have a
Yeah.
replication crisis in several of the sciences, which are having a huge issue.
Wick.
So when you
That's not
say
germane.
it's obviously easier for a climate change scientist to have their work separated from their
Like,
politics,
would you
I
The
don't
agree?
the, the,
agree.
the
Yeah.
peer the
But
peer
wait,
review
wait.
the peer review is also a little bit of a red
Yeah.
herring because arguably every Supreme Court like decision is peer reviewed by 4 other justices.
You guys are getting hung up on this. I think that the fundamental point that we're trying to make here is like, for instance, right? We could divine the truth of medical knowledge, right? There's a truth to medicine, right? We could, in theory, just know for a fact that something is medically true. Like, for instance, we have a heart. That seems pretty objective, scientific process. We seem to have understood this. We know germ theory. That seems to be pretty objectively true. Now, you can point to, yes, there's disagreements in the literature. It seems like, one study comes out and says one thing, another study comes out and says another thing. Of course, that happens in science as well. We cannot divine the truth of the matter for how to interpret a law. That is not an
But we can get a
objective thing.
pretty good,
No, you
a
can't.
pretty good idea.
Right.
If you establish that originalism is a value or textualism is a
Do you
value,
just
you
not
can.
No.
believe
Wait,
that
hold on.
the review
There's something
process
that's being
is
misstated.
efficient?
There's something so you would have to state you wouldn't be stating the originalism as value because that's just the process. I would agree with you that you would have to start with like maybe like an assumption of I care about what the law was intended to apply to. I care
Yeah.
about what the law was supposed to mean when it
Exactly.
was written. And I'm going to argue that if you care about like what the law was intended, right? Like if you don't care about that, then there's really no point in having Congress. There's really no point in having a republic. There's really no point in having a constitution, right? Because the idea is we pass laws when we have an objective to reach, when we want to get something done. And so then we pass the law. Well, what was the law intended to do? Well, that's the science. That's where the science kicks in. That's where the originalists look back and say, okay, let's try to figure out what this law was intended to do. And the non-originalists are just like, I don't care what it was intended to do. I just want to make it work for me now. And that's not scientific.
If the word
Mhm.
science is what's getting you guys hung up, fair enough. Let's just use the method, the methodology, right?
Yeah,
We can use another word.
the point,
That's
Wick.
fine. But there is a
Yeah.
methodology that is repeatable that we can go to and look and see how these things. Let me read these super chats and you can respond. I promise. I just need to
Yep,
make a
go
little
for it.
money. Okay, please. $5 from Christian Baller to say, just had to come in and say Josiah looks exactly like a younger Sean Chandler, talks about movies. Well, thank you for the $5.
I don't know who that is,
I
but
don't know
I'm
who it is
offended
either.
because I'm sure he's hideous.
Okay, $5 from Artemis Fowl to say, come on, Wick, you're getting hung up on the obvious flaws in my argument. Let me
Mhm.
shift to something else. Thank you for the $5,
Artemis.
Artemis Fowl.
Artemis is
And with that,
a,
you can respond. Go ahead, please.
Well, I'm just I,
Artemis. I was going to say Artemis is he's willing to pay $5, but not willing to actually talk to me. He's a
I
bit of a
promise
reply
you,
guy on Twitter.
He's been on my
Come
show
on in
before.
here,
he's
Artemis.
Come
he's
on
he's
in.
popped into chat before, like voice chat. He's like, listen, I love sparring with him. He's crazy, but
He's a smart
fun
guy. I
to
wish
spar
he would
with.
talk to me more.
Very smart
That's all
guy.
I'm saying, Josiah.
I'm stunned a guy that smart can come to so many wrong conclusions. But but no. So Wick, in all seriousness, though, I do want to like hammer home on this. Do you think that judicial interpretation and climate science are comparably objective?
No, I do not.
Can
But
you
that
tell
does
me why
not.
you? That's fine. Can you tell me
Sure.
why? If
Because
if
I
you're not
think that there
satisfied
is
with
a
my
more
reasons,
thorough process. There are more moving pieces involved when it comes to. There are more checks and balances, if you will, when it comes to the climate change process than there are the judicial review process.
can you
However,
name some of them?
I think peer review is one of them, even though it is flawed. And I agree it is flawed, but also you have many more actors, right? Many more
Sure.
scientists doing these researches, and it's something that a layman can replicate, right? Or at least that's the intent, whether it actually happens or not. So,
Okay.
yes, I would trust, right, the objectivity of a scientific research paper more so than I would a judicial review paper. However, that does not mean that I do not trust the judicial review paper at
I
all. And
understand.
in fact, I think that by making these comparisons and saying, well, obviously one is more than the other, so we should trust one and not trust the other, that's where I draw the line. Because I think
Nobody's
that
saying
while
no. Well,
one,
no.
that's what you're implying, is it not?
So if that's the
Or at
case,
least
we
a
would say
Boy.
I don't think Econoboy is saying never trust judicial interpretation. I think he's saying recognize it for what it is, which is not divine edict that comes from divine interpreters, that there are people who are learned, educated people granted enormous power whose interpretations have an extraordinary impact on the rest of us that in all practical terms is uncheckable for the reasons I described. Therefore, they should be expected to comply with almost superhuman integrity. And so then
Well,
let's get back to it. Let's get
no,
back to
but
it.
I disagree with a couple of those statements
Okay,
there,
go. I'm
right?
sorry. Go
So
ahead.
sure. So one, I disagree that they have this divine level of power. I don't think that's I I know that you
I
say
didn't. Oh no, I
that's
didn't
the
say
case.
that. I'm sorry. I didn't say that they were. I'm
Oh,
saying that they're not divine. That they're not divine
okay,
interpreters.
I
Yeah,
misheard. No,
I'm
yes,
saying that
they're
their power
human,
is
they're subject to
extraordinary.
mistake, and
Yeah,
that's why, again, judicial review baked into the cake means that other, right, Supreme Court makeups, I don't know the
iterations.
technical
Yeah,
word, right, can review previous decisions, right? And they can, if they wish, overturn them. I don't know how often that happens. Lactoid might, but I think that this is baked into the cake, much as like in the science thing. So, but again, right? I don't treat any human-based institution with trusting them with a divine right or divine knowledge, not even scientists, right? Not even
sure.
these other things. I wouldn't give them and grant them that
Agreed.
power either. So I think that falls flat. I also don't think that they should be subject to a superhuman level of scrutiny. I think that we need more in place. I would agree with you. Like, again, I'm not against reform. And I want to repeat that again. I'm not against reform. What I am against, again, to roll this back, is when we look at justices whose families express political opinions, even ones we think are gross, that should not be enough to cause them to want to recuse themselves from a
Yeah.
hearing. I think
So
that's
the reason, getting
wildly
back to
inappropriate.
Alito, that I support his
Oh, and I have
recusal.
$10 from Artist
Sure.
Style
Yeah, I
before
was
you
just
go.
gonna say this in part is because again, the Supreme Court Code of Ethics, Code of Conduct, demands that justices comport themselves in a way that enhances public confidence in the impartiality of the court. Again, the language is almost toothless because there's no enforcement mechanism. But I can't stress this enough. That's why people are so outraged by this. Alito saying, that was my wife seems like such a cop out. Number one, I don't know why we would assume that that's the case. And number two, with an inverted flag associated with an insurrectionist movement is flying up days after an attempted insurrection in the US Capitol, I think that does call into question the impartiality of that judge. And that's part of the reason why, for example, in a different branch, the political branches, um, you actually have a rare moment of bipartisan ethics legislation coming from James Comer and Katie Porter that not only encompasses presidents and vice presidents, but also their families. The idea is that when you're granted extraordinary power, the expectation is that those in your immediate circle, like family, are also
What about
expected.
grandkids?
What?
What if his grandkid did it? Not his wife, his grandkid. What if his cousin?
Let me put it to you like this.
What if it was his
I
uncle
think
twice
the
What if
removed?
it
argument,
was his dog, Josiah?
I think the notion of his recusal plummets, or the validity of calling for his recusal, to the extent that you believe there's any at all. I think it plummets if it's outside his house. If he has a friend flying a Trump flag, if he has a grandkid who doesn't, it was his fucking house.
Should he be able to vote?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't
Whoa,
know.
whoa, whoa,
I
whoa.
Questioning
don't know.
Marbury's
I don't
Madison,
know.
like whether or not
I
the
don't
Supreme
know.
Court can like
I don't
enforce the
I
13th
don't know.
Amendment or the First Amendment. Now you're
I don't
questioning
know if
whether
the
they can
Supreme.
vote.
I have no problem. I have no problem biting
We
that
should
bullet.
cut
I
out their
don't even know
tongues,
if they
right?
should be able to. I don't know if Supreme Court justices or Congress people, for example, should be able to own stocks.
That's
I think
different
that
than
they're.
voting.
Okay,
Well,
let
no,
me read
but
these
my
super chats.
point.
Hey,
But wait a
before we
minute.
go
But
too
my
far.
point is with the only reason I just said that I don't know is because it's an expression, like, you, by voting for a candidate, that is a political act.
Can their wife
I'm not
vote?
saying. Yes, I would grant that.
Okay, their wife can vote. Why
Yes.
can their
Can I
wife
read
vote?
these?
What's all that all about? It's a
Look, can I read
partisan
these
act.
Because
donuts?
it would be
Can I read these donuts?
That's
It
a
would be-
I wanna
household.
make
That's
a
a
point.
household vote,
hey,
Josiah.
listen,
We'll get
if
into
she
it.
doesn't, if as long as the wife doesn't hold up a sign saying I voted for this candidate,
What if she has a
I'm
sticker?
gonna read.
What if she has the I voted sticker? Is that allowed?
she can
Lactoid,
keep it under her
you're
shirt,
part of the problem here.
under the jacket.
You
Okay.
both are getting in the way of my money, and I don't like it. Falsers subscribed with Prime. Thank you. And he says, fully agree with Josiah here. It's not about justices expressing opinions we disagree with. It's about justices acting unethically and with bias. It makes it clear that they're unable to rule neutrally on the basis of the law. My question to you, Falsers, would be what in this situation of Alito has he done that makes it clear that, first of all, what was unethical? And what makes it clear that there was bias that he's unable to rule neutrally on this? I'd be very curious to hear your answer.
Wasn't he
Our-
one of like 2 justices
got
that
one.
wanted to hear Trump's challenge to the 2020 election?
I got one more. I promise. $10 from Artemis Val to say, I would love to. I'm getting ready for deployment to the Middle East. I have missed out on a lot of streams. I would love to have jumped on in. I will be more available after July.
Stay safe, buddy.
And thank you for the
Nice.
$10.
I said it first.
Oh,
I
well,
want you to be safer
you
than Wick
win.
does.
You get 10. You get well, I'm not going to give you $10. I'm going to be real clear.
That's right. You
But
need
you
to
get
hold
you
it.
get the 10 wick points for the day. There you
Yep.
go.
So I think I would answer the question, the challenge from the viewer, with kind of an unsatisfactorily vague answer. And the reason it's vague is because obviously for instance, the Supreme Court Code of Ethics that Josiah mentioned is sort of vague. Would a reasonable person infer that there's some sort of problem with this type of statement or this type of act? And obviously a lot of, Lactoid, like there's so many laws where that's sort of, it's almost like necessarily up to interpretation. A reasonable person would do X or Y, and that's what sort of determines the standard for if something is legal or illegal in many cases. But I would say that at the very least, like to draw an example, if a Supreme Court justice were to come out and openly say, "I think abortion is murder," right? Let's just say that's a pretty normal. That's a political statement that I hear from many pro-life people. Now, if a Supreme Court
Wait,
justice
what
were
if
to
he
say
came
that,
out as gay? Should he
well,
recuse himself for anything
well,
involving homosexuality?
well,
Like, for
as far
example,
as
to
yeah,
vote on gay marriage?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, being gay is not like a political statement. So I wouldn't
Yeah,
really
but there
compare the
are,
two.
again, a reasonable person can infer that maybe they have a bias.
Can women vote on
Well-
cases involving women's rights?
Well, right. So again, I'm not talking about immutable characteristics. I'm talking about
Okay,
political
but
statements.
we're talking
right?
about
So,
bias.
okay, well, again, I'm
And
talking about
immutable
bias.
characteristics can showcase bias.
So again, just to be clear, right? I'm saying I'm the one who's taken the radical position that Supreme Court justices are political actors, right? So as far as I'm personally concerned, I'm not actually as perturbed of the idea of a Supreme Court justice making a political statement. Again, I said in my opening statement that it's kind of funny that Justice Alito did this because it's one more hay in the haystack of like justices are actually partisan. They're not these sort of AI robots that just spit out opinions, right?
You said he should
But again,
recuse,
if
though.
we're
That's what you said.
well, I honestly don't remember. Maybe I did, but I think that generally, to answer the viewer's question, what I would say in this regard is if a justice were to come out and say something like abortion is murder, I think that it's difficult to separate at that point their personal political view from the rulings that they're making as a justice, right? And
I can
similarly,
argue this with, again,
no,
I
I
don't
understand,
think you
Wick.
can separate the
I
fact that you are a woman from your, again, immutable interest in women having the right to vote. So should a woman have to
mhm,
recuse herself if
yeah.
there is voting on women's issues?
So if we're framing abortion as a women's issue,
Yes.
right, and we're saying, right, so if we're framing abortion as a woman's issue and a woman, like in theory, is affected by abortion, should she be able to vote on it? I would say that would be
In the
fine,
Supreme
right? Because
Court,
I'm not sure.
like rule on it, not vote on it, rule on it in a Supreme Court setting.
What if
Right.
she's
So
had an
again, it's
abortion?
about. Well, if you've had a certain experience, I'm fine with people having experiences and it coloring their view, right? So again, what we're talking about is ethical concerns here, right? So when a Supreme Court justice were to come out, and I keep trying to draw the example and say abortion is murder, right? I think that it's difficult to separate out their view between essentially their personal political view and what they actually rule, right? Because naturally they've come out and they've made the statement. And so to the viewer's question, I think that if a Supreme Court justice were to come out and say, "Oh, I support January 6th. I think it was the moral right of people to do this." This isn't what Justice Alito done. This is just an example. I think certainly it would call into question their impartiality on this issue. Now, Wick, to your point, if you were to say, "Well, look at this woman ruling on women's issues," like doesn't that call into question her impartiality? I suppose it could. It's a subjective standard. Would a reasonable person really say that a woman couldn't vote on a woman's issue? I mean, I wouldn't say so, but I would say that's more reasonable to say,
No,
well,
no,
if
that's
you're
not the
saying that
question.
January 6th was well,
No, I'm not going to let you do that. That's not
I
the
think he
directly
question.
meant
answered your
vote as
question.
in the capacity of a Supreme Court,
In the capacity of a Supreme Court
Well, that's
justice,
the
right?
context that we're
Would a
talking about. Yeah.
reasonable person infer that this justice has a bias that would
Yeah, I
prohibit
don't
them from
I
ruling
don't
in
think
a objective way? And
I
I
don't
think the
think
argument could very well be made
so
in the case of
obviously
homosexuality, in the case of women's rights, in the
yeah,
case of black issues, right? A whole host of issues where
obviously
you could
in
argue, and a reasonable person
okay,
could infer that the fact
Wick,
that they
Wick,
hold these statuses
Wick,
would indicate a
Wick.
possible
If
bias.
your problem is the concept of using the word reasonable person, then we have to get rid of so much jurisprudence in our law presently. Now, the reason people use that phrase is because it's a convenient phrase and it's able to be interpreted
But that
over
jurisprudence doesn't
time,
agree with
right?
you, right? Like historically, like
No,
the reasonable
likewise.
people of America don't agree with your position.
What do you
Lactoid.
mean?
The reason I say this is
There's no
because Wick
rule
is
against
saying,
there's no rule against
okay,
pro-lifers voting on abortion issues on the Supreme Court.
I
But I don't think that
understand
was his
that,
position, was
Lactoid,
it?
right?
He made the hypothetical he made is that if a Supreme Court justice came out with the statement abortion is murder, right? That there would be a reasonable expectation
Well,
of
wait a
bias
minute, but
in
see,
that.
but
No,
but
that's
hang on.
not.
I think that's the problem. See,
Those are
I
two
don't
separate
think
statements, right?
I
So,
don't. Well, yeah.
really quick, because just to finish the point, there's a reasonable person could say that you're biased for all sorts of reasons, right? However, does it raise to the level of an ethical concern so serious that it merits recusal from a case? That's a totally different question, right? We might say, "Oh, because you're black, you're naturally gonna, be more sympathetic to like black issues or something." And I don't think that's an incorrect statement, right? Because obviously, black people see the world in a, under a different lens because they're black and I'm not black, and so we have a different
Yes,
worldly
I think there's a
experience, right?
stronger reason to believe that than there is because someone's family member flied a flag that they're incapable of ruling in an unbiased manner. I think that
Well, it goes to
in one
Josiah's points of
instance,
his
there's
house.
a much stronger argument than in the other.
Okay. So a couple of things. I think that there's a difference. So just a few things. Number one, I don't think any of us here believe that any of the Supreme Court justices are biased automatons. I think that's the point, right? They're given too much discretion under the presumption that they are. They're not. So the other problem is too, I don't think anyone is demanding recusal on the notion that a person is biased. If that's the case, then we wouldn't say that Alito should recuse himself because of the flag. We would say Alito should recuse himself because he's conservative and he's deciding a case where a conservative has a material interest. We're talking about instances which pierce the veneer of impartiality. Because again, if you look at much of the Supreme Court Code of Conduct and ethics experts who have weighed in on this, they talk about the veneer of impartiality. No one here thinks it's reasonable to assume that a Supreme Court justice, liberal or conservative, can be unbiased. They're not. It's almost like play acting, so to speak. They have an obligation, in my opinion, particularly given the accommodations that are afforded to them, no elections, re-elections, all the shit that I mentioned, to not behave in a way that suggests impartiality. A congressman can say, fuck Trump, fuck Biden, whatever, all damn day. I would lose my shit if a Supreme Court justice said any of those things, right? They may think it, because we're not thought police. We can't determine whether or not they have those biases. But I think that they have to behave above political actors in terms of concealing whatever biases they have. So I don't think it's fair to say, can a pro-lifer preside or a pro-choicer preside over an abortion case? It depends on how whatever biases they may have internalized have manifested themselves. Because that's the whole point. The judiciary has neither the purse nor the sword. What they have is judgment. That's a quote from Madison or Hamilton. The idea was it was public trust in the court. And when you have a court behaving openly partisanly, I think it's fair to call their impartiality into question. The only reason I'm upset about the flag, if it was truly Alito's wife, it was Alito's house. Alito could have been like, hey, take the fucking flag down. I'm a Supreme Court justice. This is insane. and instead it was left up for days, weeks after, or days after the January 6th insurrection. I don't think it's unreasonable, Wick, to expect more from a Supreme Court justice in this respect. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so Lactoid has us at a colossal disadvantage here. But I will say it's not like just one or two lawyers across the country or judicial ethics experts have also. Lindsey fucking Graham, a Republican, came out and said, "Yeah, that was really stupid. That was a lapse in judgment."
Stupidity and a lapse in judgment is one thing, and I might even agree with that.
I think it may have been
But we're
before
not
it came out
talking-
that his wife did it, by the way.
Right. Yeah. And that aside, right? The question is it enough to require him morally? Let's not even talk about legally, right? Morally.
It wasn't Lactoid because the
recuse
news
himself?
broke about his wife the same day. It was part of the story.
Okay,
Just
again,
FYI. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm uninterested in the timeline. Personally, maybe you guys are. I don't know. It doesn't matter to me whether it came out before or after. My point remains that I don't think it is reasonable to ask a Supreme Court justice to police his family, right, from having their political opinions, even if he disagrees or agrees. I don't know. I know plenty of couples who have vast disagreements in their politics, right? I think that when it comes down to it, again, we got to talk about what has he done, what has he said, and gang, we have rulings from Alito on things regarding the insurrection, right? Can you point to me in anything, any line in his rulings, in his reasonings that show, in your opinion, that he is a biased actor and a non-impartial actor? Can you do that? Do you have anything?
Well, I don't think that we are going to be able to point you to a quote that says, "I'm Justice Alito, I'm biased, and I'm just a right wing."
I'm
Yeah,
not
what would
asking
that
for
what would
that.
that look like? Out of curiosity.
Well, yeah, that's the issue. Like fundamentally, is that we can point you to an hour ago when Josiah said we can
Show
point
me
you to a conservative making conservative rulings, right? But we have to obviously infer a lot. So
Okay, but I don't need perfection here. I just need something. Anything. Surely you
But
have
with
something.
respect, you're shifting
One
the
line.
standard. With
If
respect,
your argument is that he has made himself a biased actor, that we cannot trust his impartiality, I'm asking you to provide evidence of that in his rulings since the time. This was back in
I'm
2021.
so
He's made
one
plenty of rulings regarding this since then. So where has this manifested
so
in his rulings?
I am familiar only with two Supreme Court cases, one was a Supreme Court case and the other was an attempt by that pertained to January 6th in the 2020 election. And there probably been many more, but again, just off the top of my head, one was an attempt by Trump to challenge the results of Pennsylvania. Alito wanted to hear the case, but a majority of justices said, "Fuck no, we're not taking Trump's case on this," and they refused to grant certiorari. The other one, I believe, was the January 6th defendant's case over the text. I know Clarence Thomas dissented in that, and many believe in part that was because his wife, Ginny Thomas, was texting Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. I don't know where Alito presided on that, or however many other cases. But can I just add this again with respect? I'm curious what the standard is for you, because according to the very judicial standard, you don't have to prove partiality or bias. You have to just reasonably question it.
No, hold on. So I just reread through the whole thing, and also there's a couple things. First of all, I'm under ethics codes, but only as it pertains to the practice of law, right? And that's historically what this has always been. You can on your personal life, you obviously can express political bias. There's a reason I am allowed to be on these shows and express my political opinion, despite the fact that I'm a practicing attorney.
Are you covered under 28? Just out of curiosity, is your standard the same as a judge?
It's not going to be the same as a Supreme Court justice, which are arguably I'm under more strict standards. But
certainly practically, but I mean,
yeah, we can talk about how perhaps that could be an issue. But what I'm saying is that you got multiple problems here, because not only has this historically been understood and how it's been understood to apply to people involved in the legal profession generally, but also you keep saying, well, he violated this. The problem with this is he actually, even the thing you're pointing to, he didn't violate, because that came out in 2023, and this allegation is from 2020. So
the 2023 thing.
So 2023 is when Roberts brought forward the Code of Ethics, right? And so this flag apparently was flown upside down back in 2020, right? So this was before the ethics. So he didn't.
2021, to be clear.
2021. You're right. You're right. 2021, right? So still before this code of ethics, this toothless, as you already alluded to, this toothless code of ethics was put forward. So he didn't break shit, and his wife didn't even break shit because the law wasn't, or that quote unquote law wasn't even around at the time.
So I've been referring to two things, perhaps recklessly interchangeably. One was 28 U.S. Code Section 255, referencing, judges should recuse themselves in the case that their impartiality may be reasonably questioned. And then the U.S. Supreme Court Code of Conduct, which was released, yes, in November of 2023, effectively repeats the same thing. So I don't know when 28 U.S. Code 255 was issued. But yeah, the U.S. Code of Conduct was 2023. Both of them, I believe, the standard applies to Supreme Court justices because it makes reference to any judge, justice, or magistrate. Number one. Number two, I want to make sure I understand.
What subsection was that again?
It's
20,
either
28.
It's 255 or 455. It's something 55.
28 U.S. Code.
I know it's 28 U.S. Code. Yeah. So while you're looking that up, so my understanding is if the event which could reasonably call Alito's impartiality into question happened prior to the ethics code being published, and then he's in a position to preside over cases after. So the offending event, the code was established, and then the presiding of a case. He can preside over the case because the code was published after the offending event.
Yeah, because if you're saying here's a code that applies that we don't want you to do this thing, but you had already done it, it would make no sense. It would be like if tomorrow we criminalize, like we raise the speed or we drop the speed limit, and we found out that you had been speeding beforehand.
Yeah, but you're talking about a criminal imposition, not a standard of ethics. If my understanding would be, it'd be like me saying, "Hey, Lactoid, you can't preside this case. You can't do this thing, Judge Lactoid. If you expressed a conservative opinion before, but I actually don't know I don't know what we would compare it to. I'm struggling to understand this here because the bias, the impartiality, wouldn't the question of impartiality persist before and after the code was published? Like it doesn't say the code doesn't say if you do something that causes your impartiality to be questioned, like there's not a statute of limitations, is there?
Well, it wouldn't be based on a statute of limitations. It'd be based on the kind of prevailing legal understanding that you can't hold people responsible for like things that are now passed. If you pass current laws or current standards, no, not just criminally, like even like civilly, right? Generally speaking.
But civilly carries a penalty associated with it, right? We're talking about a recusal.
All that Josiah is saying is, like, for instance, like if we take a more extreme example and say, like, if Justice Alito said, I'm a Trump supporter, I'm voting for Trump, and because of that, I think the election is stolen, and I'm going to rule in his favor. Let's just say Alito came out and said that. Just because he comes out and says that before the ethics code was published doesn't mean that there's not an ongoing reasonable concern that his impartiality can be questioned, right? I mean, just because it was a past statement, that sounds like quite an odd way to enforce that.
I don't think that you can look to the standard itself as violating the code. I agree with you though that if he said like, and I'm going to rule this way, that's like I'm going to rule for him no matter what.
Yeah, we have to infer a lot. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That one threw me, Lactoid. I hear what you're saying. Certainly, with respect to a law, we can't like retroactively punish somebody for a violation of a law that didn't exist. But the standard of, again, you should recuse yourself in the event that your impartiality may be reasonably questioned. It certainly predates 2023 and 2020. 28, again, U.S. Code subsection. It may be 455. I've been saying 255, but I know. Hang on, let me just check here.
I also don't think there's an enforcement mechanism for 455.
Well, of course, right. That's part of the problem. So particularly for Supreme Court justices, that's the problem with the situation. There is no enforced, even the one that Roberts dropped, there's no enforcement mechanism.
Well, then let me ask you, Josiah, before we get to closings, because we do need to close up shop here soon. If we do pass ethics reform, right, and give it teeth, if it has teeth to it, do we think it should be retroactively enforceable?
I'm sorry, I was reading chat. Do I think what would be retroactively enforceable?
If we do pass reforms on ethics reforms for the Supreme Court, right? We have a bipartisan thing. We pass these reforms, and these reforms have teeth. Do you think that should be retroactively enforceable? So people who violated the ethics code that didn't exist beforehand, right? Should they face the punishment or
Well, again, I don't
the
think there'd be punishment. It
retribution?
would just be
Right?
it would be a recusal.
But
But yes,
if
I
they
do.
referred to if
Yeah,
they
because
refused to do it, they're like, well, hey, this
then
wasn't
yeah,
the rule
no,
10
then
years
yeah,
ago.
then yes, because
Why should I be expected to follow this now?
if recusal is about questioning biases and we have evidence of biases which predates the establishment
Okay,
of code, I still
I
think, yeah, of course, it would have to be retroactive.
So
100% agree with you.
here's like the issue. The 455 again, none of these have teeth, but 455, like we've pointed out, like I think there also is a line problem for you guys where when we say they should disqualify himself in the following circumstances where they have a personal bias or prejudice concerning a party. I'm guessing that's the one sentence. There's a bunch of extra, but that's the sentence that would appear to be most apt to your argument.
I thought there was one that
Um,
said shall disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might be reasonably questioned. Shall.
Specifically, where he has a personal bias or prejudice concerning a party, because that is like kind of the explanation of subsection A. It looks like. The problem with that is like kind of going back to your point. Well, what if they wear an "I voted" sticker? What if they voted? What if they are, religious? What if they happen to belong to a minority group? Can we really trust a black person to rule on something that affects like on cases involving the NAACP? Should Justice Jackson have recused herself when it came to the voting rights cases among like racial lines because she is part of a minority group that may benefit from that voting power, right? There's all sorts of things that we can look into. Um, and I think this is part of the problem with maybe putting teeth on here is you guys seem to think that like, well, obviously his wife putting the flag upside down is enough for us to reasonably question. When it comes to Ginsburg, maybe I don't know if you guys have said it explicitly. Maybe you also think that's enough that she should have recused herself with every case involving Trump. But I think that for me and Wick, we're having a much more, I guess, solid foundation here of like if you have a personal political opinion that we don't think this should be a basis for you to recuse yourself. Like if you believe and you've shown a history of making logical, reasoned out decisions in which you're not referencing or using your own political bias, you're showing your work. Just in the same way, this is why I made the reference to like the environmental scientists, not to necessarily compare the nuances of environmental science and climate change to law, but to say that the same principle should hold, where it's like, yes, you may have your personal biases here, but if the paper's good, right? If the psychology paper is good, if you're referencing stuff that we know, if you're looking back historically and making good arguments, let them stand on their own. Let them stand on their
Blackthorn,
own merit.
let me ask you this then. I'm
You can
curious
ask me
again.
this after you
Yeah.
ask this, so we're gonna get to closing statements. Cool.
Could a Supreme Court justice in theory work backwards from an outcome going into a case? They're presiding over a case. You can assume it's a liberal justice. I don't care. A justice is hearing petitioners in front of that they've granted cert to, and for whatever reason, let's just use a comical example. They're like, "Fuck this guy. I like the other guy instead. I'm going to rule in his favor." And could they work backwards and come up with a well-reasoned opinion to justify their decision?
It's possible that you could, it's possible that like in the same way you could have like a left winger who's like, I'm gonna go prove that climate change is real, and then like they're doing the research and it like they actually have good evidence. Yeah, sure, it's possible.
So I guess my question is because it seems to me, and again, you're the lawyer, I'm not, is that lawyers and Supreme Court justices, judges of all types, because the law is so complex, given the body of jurisprudence, given the rich history in this United States, I think you would agree that there's very rarely like a perfectly consistent consensus of historical fact. Basically, if you want to cherry pick certain precedents and historical facts to achieve a particular outcome, it seems to me, and I also bet, again, I'm not the attorney, but other attorneys, other judicial scholars would also say, yeah, Josiah's right. You can cherry pick these things and come to a particular outcome. Would you concede to that?
It's possible, and what you just said actually made me think of. I'm going to keep with the climate and the psychology example, but I
Sure.
think the best, most apt example here is going to be historians, right?
Sure.
Historians disagree on what happened in history, and
Sure.
do you agree with me that there should at least be some kind of method when they're trying to figure out what happened in history? They should go be looking at like books. They should be trying to find primary sources. They should be
Yeah.
trying to do something instead of just pulling it out of their ass. And if a
Right.
historian had a history of just pulling it out of their ass, and when questioned, well, my philosophy as a historian is I just want to pull it out of my ass.
Yeah.
I don't have any respect for this historian because they're not going with the method that gives us the closest picture of history.
Right. So I understand, but I guess the reason that, and again, I can't speak for Econo Boy, the reason I'm so unsatisfied by this, and again, not an attorney, got a political science degree, you're the lawyer, but I've read works by legal scholars who say that there is no perfect paradigm of judicial interpretation, that even originalism or textualism, you can cherry pick to get a desired outcome. People, and again, I'm not saying this to denigrate you, people who know more about the law than you do have come to this conclusion, which is why I have this conclusion that when they say there is no infallible objective standard and you can cloak a particular outcome in the veneer of originalism and textualism, there's ample basis to do so. Maybe you would agree, maybe you wouldn't.
I wouldn't even disagree with that. I understand that there are people who do this just in the same way that, like, a great example would be the tobacco research
Sure.
centers, right? Where, they
Right.
were scientists, right? But they were cherry picking specific data to get to a particular outcome. Sure,
Right.
right? But my response to that would be they weren't engaged in good science. Just like I would say that people who do this are not engaged in good originalism.
Sure.
Same logic applies, right? But there's a difference, I think, between at least trying to engage in science, or at least like doing your best, as opposed to just throwing out the concept of science.
Okay,
Right.
gang. I'm sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt this, right? But we do have a hard cutoff at 8, and I
Let's
want to
do
make
it.
Wait,
sure.
are we not bringing people on
Oh, we
to
can do some call-ins, but that's why
oh,
we got
okay.
to cut it off at 8, because if
Oh,
we
sorry.
keep going and then we do call-ins, we got like, you know what I mean, right? Like it's gonna take a bit. Um,
Are you saying
here's
you have other fucking obligations?
I know it's crazy. My dog's
God.
just I see her right over there. She's walking around. I'm like, oh well, she probably needs out, right? Anyway,
Sure.
gang, thanks for coming by. If you liked tonight's content, and I
It
hope
was
you
great.
did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We're going to give each of these wonderful individuals a chance to tell people their closing thoughts on the matter and where you can find them. And I encourage you, when they do, and their links are all in the description too, by the way. Click those links, okay? Subscribe to their channels as well. Give them all the updates, likes, all those things, because all these individuals have been very pleasant to talk to. I fight, but I love each and every one of you. Okay, I know we get heated. I know we throw bows. I know we get frustrated, but I still love you. Okay. With that said, we're gonna start with Josiah. We're gonna end with Lactoid. Josiah, closing statement. Go ahead.
Yeah, so again, as far as I'm concerned, the Supreme Court is a political body, and we just have to expect it to be, and we have to start treating it accordingly. I also will fully cop to the fact I don't think that there are these hard lines. It's part of the reason why I support ethics reforms, because we have to have like retired judges or maybe the chief judges of certain circuits or whatever form like an ethics panel. We kind of have to suss these things out and feel these things out the way we do any other judicial or ethical consideration constitutional question in this country. The Supreme Court has enormous power. As a general proposition, given the enormous power they have, they should be held to very high standards. They should be held, as far as I'm concerned, in the current iteration, to higher standards than presidents and lawmakers, because at least we can vote presidents out. There are term limits for presidents. There are terms established for people in Congress. Right now, the Supreme Court conducts itself in a way with no oversight and the power to strike down the vast majority of actions by Congress or the president. With great power comes great responsibility. So we should impose structural reforms to the U.S. Supreme Court, which should apply to conservatives and liberals. On Alito specifically, all I'll say, the flag was flown at his house. The timetable is suspect. I think he has demonstrated in the past that he is favorable to conservatives and to Republicans. He wanted to hear a Supreme Court challenge to Biden's victory. He was one of the few that wanted to. I don't trust that. And I don't think we should give the judges the benefit of the doubt, conservative or liberal, because again, they should be held to the highest possible standard, which is why the codes say if their impartiality may reasonably be questioned. That's my view. I'm looking forward to chatting about this more. I love three of you. or two of you, not three of you. I'll leave it to people to guess which one I hate the most. It's obviously Wick, because I love Lactoid, because Lactoid's a Biden voter, much like me. You can find me at youtube.com/@ponderingpolitics.
Check him out, gang. Man, he's doing some great work. He's a great guy. Give him some love. I'll go next, and we'll go with Boy, and then we'll go to Lactoid to finish us off. So when it comes to reform, I'm all for reform. Devil's in the details, of course. I don't support all reforms, but I think reasonable reforms, bipartisan reforms, are something that I support and I would like to see happen. But we can't separate these accusations out from the context, right? And I don't think there's precedent for this kind of recusal. We have incidents in the past, most recently that I'm aware of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg making very political comments on the cases which she sat in on regarding Trump's tax returns, right? And I think that it would not have been reasonable to ask her to recuse herself simply because she had an opinion, just like simply because his wife has an opinion doesn't mean we should ask Justice Alito to recuse himself in that matter. There's no precedent for it. If we want to make that the precedent in the future, I don't agree with it, but we can have that discussion. But as of now, I don't think that that meets that test. The idea of a reasonable person finding biases, right? You have to have a better standard than just suspicion. You have to have solid evidence that a reasonable person would, again, believe these things. And I don't think that the evidence presented in the case of Alito has been convincing to me on this panel. Gang, I encourage you, if you want to see reforms, if you want to see more Democrats in Congress and in legislature, which I do, vote in November. Vote blue. Vote up and down the ticket. Vote for Biden. That's how we're going to get these things done. Not by fiat, not by leveraging these arcane rules, not by partisan hackery, but by simply voting. And that is the most powerful tool we have. Gang, thank you for being here. If you like what again, this is my channel. Like and subscribe. All that shit, okay? Boy, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Wick. Obviously, it's always fun. It's always fun sparring with people of a different political view, of course. I watched. I was watching. I was making my way through the last Wick panel of Does Debate Matter? And certainly, I think debate matters, and I think at the very least, it's fun to participate in. So it's always good to be invited. In terms of the question of the debate, so. I kind of establish a fundamental foundation. I think that Lactoid, and I think that oftentimes conservatives are very unable to contend with this general sort of framework that I have, which is that legal interpretation is not like history, right? It's not a science, right? It's any legal method that you use is subjective in nature, and we have to have values-based reasons to enforce any particular method, right? So, like Lactoid says, I'm an originalist, or at the very least, like I think originalism should be a requirement for a framework for justices to interpret the Constitution. There's values-based reasons for why he would say that, right? And I think there's values-based reasons for why I would say that's probably not always the best way to interpret law. And given this, there's kind of two worlds that we can live in, right? The one, the more openly partisan sort of values-based justice world, or the two, the world that we semi live in, which is the world of pretend, where we kind of make up legal philosophies that are objective, quote unquote, which of course no such thing exists. Now, does this mean that I think that justices should just rule based on their personal political beliefs? Well, no, of course not, right? I mean, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that we can establish scopes of the court, ethics requirements that they're bounded to, and of course, I think that generally speaking, you should have a sound legal framework for, why you believe in a certain thing. Typically speaking, for liberal justices, that's going to be some combination of like textual understanding, framers' intent, originalism, to come to some reasonable legal framework that's applicable. And of course, I think that there's a broad acceptance of a utilitarian standard with a lot of, with a lot of liberal justices. And I think that that's probably fine as well. Of course, we can debate about what standard makes sense, but I don't know. I think that where we differ fundamentally is this idea that the Supreme Court could basically just rule anything, and as long as they have, in theory, an original, interpretive reason for ruling it, that just makes it okay, or at the very least, there's nothing to do in that regard other than just pass a constitutional amendment. I think that there's probably more catastrophic rulings that the court can do that I would say there's a serious problem ideologically with the Supreme Court. And the last thing that I'll say is that every single reform that I recommend leads to a more thoughtful analysis of justices because an independent screening process ensures basically more qualified judges and more qualified justices. I would say that democratic reforms lead to people feeling like they're more represented and feeling like they have generally speaking, more confidence in their institutions. If you feel like my reforms turn a country into an authoritarian hellscape, I don't know. I look at Canada, I look at the UK, I look at the Nordic countries, I look at broader Western Europe. Seems like they're doing just fine, right? So I wouldn't really call any of those countries authoritarian at the very least. And so that's pretty much my view. I think the Supreme Court needs a bunch of reforms. I don't think it's authoritarian. And on the Alito question, yeah, I mean, I think it obviously calls into question his like quote unquote objective judgment or like his nonpartisan judgment when he's got a flag representing essentially January 6th and like this sort of anti-America stop the steal movement on his house. I don't know. I feel like that's a reasonable thing to say. So.
Where can people find you?
Oh yeah, Kana Boy on YouTube, and I don't really talk a lot of judicial philosophy on Three Wonks, more empirical judgments, I guess. But if you're interested in policy, more scientific policy discussions, let's say, you can always go to Three Wonks on YouTube and check us out there. So
check them out, gang. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate the discussion. I go hard on you because I love you. Okay, all right, it's all in good fun. Last but certainly not least, Black Toy TV. Go ahead.
All right, so a couple things. Firstly, I just want to really emphasize here the importance of Marbury versus Madison. There was somebody on the panel before who wasn't quite sure about the importance of that. I just really want to emphasize here that case really exemplified the power of the court that was written in the Constitution. And I think that there's plenty of originalist angles to defend it from, which is what I would do. But I want to point out, because our friends over here really care about the outcomes, that without Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court would be unable to strike down laws against slavery, or so they'd be able to strike down laws in favor of slavery, because the 13th Amendment, well, the Supreme Court can't strike down federal statutes then, because lack of judicial review, they wouldn't be able to do anything. It essentially doesn't just make the Supreme Court a lesser branch, it makes it no real branch. It makes it a toothless branch. It makes it a rubber stamp. It makes it completely unable to do anything in the American context. Marbury versus Madison was correctly decided, and that's something that all credible legal scholars are going to get behind me on. The court is not a intrinsically partisan body, and this is, part of the evidence of this is justices on the same side often disagree. But it also has to do with the very nature of what the body is supposed to do, right? The goal of the Supreme Court is to avoid partisanship. That's part of the reason why Supreme Court members don't have term limits that are based on popularity. They shouldn't be making decisions based on what the popular will is. The concept is same as tenure, right? We don't want a professor publishing research that just happens to become unpopular. If it's the right kind of research, if it's principled research, if it's an attempt at actual framework, and then get removed just because of the politicians in the area don't like what they're doing. That's the reason why we have tenure, and that's the reason why we should be protecting Supreme Court justices from partisanship. Originalism is the only real scientific method when it comes to judicial review. If you accept that laws mean anything, a law in of itself is a directive. If you believe that directives are important, then you must accept originalism. Rule of law requires originalism. Without any originalism, we would not have rule of law. Think about it. Let's remove originalism tomorrow. Now, what does the Supreme Court base any of their decisions on? Just what they feel at the time. Complete anarchy. There's no framework to it, no structure to it. It's based on partisan outcomes. The Alito complaints specifically are an example of what I think is blatant partisanship and an attack on the legitimacy of the court because of partisan interests. Our opposition, I believe, during this discussion was, as much as I like them, was being unreasonable on this. I think his wife should obviously be able to have and express opinions, whether that be through flying a flag, wearing a button, voting. We shouldn't be going after people because of what they do on their own time, because of the opinions that they happen to hold. That's absent from their judicial philosophy. Finally, and this is the last point I'm going to end on, it was brought up earlier in this discussion that look how unpopular the Supreme Court is, right? It was rapidly losing popularity. It's losing legitimacy, and this is why we have to change it. This is why we have to reform it, potentially remove the members. Well, I just want to point out that right now the Supreme Court has an approval rating of 41%, which is higher than Biden's 38%. So if we're going entirely off approval rating, then if you want to say at 41% we should remove and change the Supreme Court, maybe it's time to change the president too.
Where can people find you?
Find me at Lactoid TV on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube.
Check it out, gang. Okay, gang, for a little bit at least, we're going to take your calls. So if you would like to yell at any of us, me, Josiah, Lactoid, Econoboy, jump backstage. We'll pull you in and we'll talk to you. So I put the links in the YouTube, the Kick, and the Twitch. You click that link, you accept the rules, and then you jump backstage. We'll pull you in. We got a
While
caller. Oh,
you
go
have one
ahead.
already?
Yeah.
Perfect. Fuck, I want to get into separation of powers and shit with Lactoid, but maybe that'll have to happen at a different time. Go ahead.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's fine. Maybe he'll ask about separation of
Maybe
powers.
he will. People's Elbow. Hello, welcome.
Yo, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
We got
All
you.
right, cool. Hey, thanks for letting me on. This could have been a really insightful conversation, but we never really got talking about whatever these alleged ethical improprieties are on Alito's behalf, right? We've got these this fake crisis because apparently for some short amount of time at Alito's house, a flag was flown upside down, yet nobody, neither of our two guys here on the panel, even attempted to articulate why that flag flown in that way was a demonstrable signal of support for an insurrection, let alone for a stop the steal, right? Um, the original reporting on this from the New York Times cited exactly one person, this Alex Newhouse, PhD student from the University of Colorado, as the basis for concluding that this flag, carried by like 3 people on January 6th, represented a stop the steal symbol. Notwithstanding that this flag has been around for generations, and yet all of a sudden, because 3 people carried it and a PhD student at Colorado says it's a symbol of stop the steal, now this flag transforms Alito now into an insurrectionist. Secondly, the same flag, or a flag at his vacationing home, flown not upside down, but has been around since George Washington, as a flag of the Massachusetts Merchant Marine, is now all of a sudden a flag of a symbol of hate, a flag representing insurrection, and I guess because, well, again, Alex Newhouse at the University of Colorado is the same person. So it would have been nice to hear why Alito selling stock in beer companies, for example, was also an ethical impropriety. None of these things add up to an ethical impropriety, but it would have been interesting to at least debate this, unless Boy and Josiah are just um, conceding the L on it. I mean,
We're gonna
Well,
have to let him
yeah, I mean,
respond. By the way,
if
go
no,
ahead.
I'm good. Thank
obviously,
you.
yeah, so obviously, if the argument, generally speaking, is going to be, well, the standard of evidence must be clear and presently obvious that a person is politically biased in a way that informs their rulings, then it's very difficult for any standard, for any like actual evidence to reach that standard. Now, at the same time, I think that historically, if we understand, well, upside down flags are typically, and we can quibble with this, for God's sakes, if we argue against this, then I'm just going to assume bad faith. Upside down U.S. flags are typically meant to represent some like foundational problem with the structure of the government or our society, right? Like, oh, our society is going to hell. We've flown a flag upside down to represent this. I think that's generally understood to be the case. Now, the fact that this flag was seen right after January 6th and the inauguration of Joe Biden was soon to take place in January of 2021, I would say strains my credulity that yes, probably if we believe it was the wife of Samuel Alito and he's not just making that up, which of course you have no evidence to assume otherwise, but let's just assume that that's the case. I would say it strains my credulity to say that it's just it's just an upside down flag. Doesn't mean anything. Fuck the fact that the timing makes sense. Fuck the historical understanding of this symbol. I mean, I just,
Yeah, well, and
it
also
seems like an absurd argument.
I'll also add that this came on the heels of Alito's wife having an alleged dispute with an anti-Trump neighbor holding up putting up an anti-Trump yard sign. I think it was "fuck Trump." Yeah, so I'm with you. I think there's too much circumstantial evidence there for me to give Alito the benefit of the doubt. Not that I'm really obligated to in the first place, but yeah, it would be like me assuming that the swastika, which is probably above this guy's bed, is because he's Buddhist, right? No, you're probably just a Nazi. At the end of the day, yeah, or that the Confederate flag, which is right beside it, is because he loves the Dukes of Hazzard. right? I mean, in all seriousness, kidding aside, yeah, I think that, again, we don't have to prove beyond any or all reasonable doubt. I think that there's enough there to seriously question Alito's impartiality. And again, also the appearance of impropriety, right? These justices, we're not talking about any sort of criminal standard. We're talking about these justices, which are supposed to be impartial, above partisanship in terms of their rulings and in terms of their considerations. And if that can be reasonably questioned by their behavior, they should recuse themselves. And again, I think, by the way, I'll also just say before I turn it back to you, I think that I'm taking this at face value, but some of the things that you said about Justice Ginsburg and others from, I don't recall because that's been 8 years ago, but from your recollection of it, yeah, that sounds pretty fucking sus. So again, I think it's a standard that should apply to both liberal and
Should he be
conservative
able
justices.
to force his wife to take down the flag?
He should have taken down the flag, yeah.
What if his
himself.
wife said no? I'm going to put it back up, and you're gone for most of the day, so you can't stop me.
So does she have the right to force the flag upon him? This is a thing that goes both ways. This is ridiculous.
No,
Yeah, I
it's
don't
no,
think
no,
he
no,
should
no,
be
no.
able to
It's their
beat his
house.
wife.
Wait, hold on. It's their house, so she has the right to put up whatever flag she wants, right?
And he has the right to take it down, right?
Sure, he has the right to take it down, but
There
like,
you go. You answered your fucking
wait,
question,
hold on.
Lactoid.
But then she could.
Lactoid, I tell
Oh
you
no,
what,
she can
Lactoid,
put it
you know
right
what?
back up again,
Hey,
can't
asshole.
she?
Hey, asshole, you listen here.
She can put it right back up.
Wait a minute. If Alito said, listen, I recognize that would look pretty fucking sus, so I asked her to take it down. She said no, and I didn't want to have the fight, or I took it down, she put it back up. That would at least be something, a recognition of a sitting Supreme Court justice in his 70s that flying
Isn't he
an
just
inverted
a
flag.
point of
He has to say that he doesn't want to have to fight
real
with his
quick.
wife about it.
Hey, just real quick from
That'd be
all of
nice.
you, because I'm not sure the answer to this.
Sure.
Yeah.
In his response, did he know about the flag being flown at the time?
Yes, I think. I don't know. I can't remember.
I mean, to me,
Yes,
it's
I
not
think
about.
we don't know.
To me,
Yeah, let me
it's not
find out.
about whether or not
Because
he
if he
knew.
didn't
Again,
know, then how
Oh
could he
yeah,
ask
well
her
wait
to
a
take it
minute. Hold
down?
on.
it's
Wait
the
a minute.
appearance of impropriety, right? It's whether or not you can
Okay,
question.
but this appearance of impropriety applies to, as I said, someone who comes out as homosexual,
I
ruling
don't think
on
it's
gay marriage.
improper to come out as gay. Though.
Okay,
Like,
this
these are
is
two
the
different
actual
things,
here. The
right?
statement said he had no involvement whatsoever in flying of the flag. He said this was briefly, which maybe he did take it down, placed by Mrs. Alito in response to the neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs.
And then he
So
took
mean,
it
I-
down.
Let's not
no
wait,
involvement
hold on.
whatsoever is what he said.
It-
Right,
it-
and let's
well,
not
no, but-
forget that their neighbors
Yeah.
acknowledged that this dispute was going on between Alito's wife and the neighbors. So while we can
Right.
get suspect and skeptical of the timing, so-called timing, what we can't be suspect about is that the actual neighbors, right, articulated the same rationale reasoning that the Alitos
Mhm.
have, right? So there was a dispute. There was objectionable language on yard signs. Alito's wife took what she felt was a comparable stance. Now, again, it's not our practice, and it ought not to be, that we do not impugn the impartiality of judges because their spouses have specific political views. We don't do that. It's not
Okay.
fair to do that. It's an unreachable, unmeetable standard, and that's why we don't
So
impugn the
people's level.
impartiality in this way.
That's not exactly what we're doing, right? So again,
No, it's
like
precisely what
no,
Josiah
it's
did.
not precise.
It is.
So you haven't been listening, if that's what you think,
Oh,
right? So
okay.
again,
Let's review then.
for instance, well, hold
Alito's
on,
wife
people's
Hold
level.
on.
So,
You just- hey,
Hold on.
people.
You
So,
gotta let Conboy finish his
okay.
reasoning, and then you can
Yeah.
respond. I promise. Go ahead.
Okay.
So for example, okay, the reason I keep harping on appearance of impropriety, appearance of bias, right? Let's use another example, right? Typically speaking, and Lactoid, obviously you can disagree. I mean, it'd be shocking if you did, but let's just say that I'm a prosecutor for a local, district, right? I'm a district attorney and I'm a prosecutor working at the district attorney's office. Let's say that my brother committed a murder or allegedly committed a murder and he's being charged with murder. Now, it could be the case. It could be the case that I am just so ethically pure, I could objectively prosecute my own brother with just as much rigor as I could anyone else. Okay, it could be the case. You could hook me up to a lie detector, and I could prove, well, as much as a lie detector can prove anything, that is the case, right? But we would say that the appearance of impropriety is enough to say you should not be involved in that case. I think anybody would agree with that. Now, there's obviously a debate about whether or not having an upside down flag, and I agree, it's fairly subjective. We have to infer some things. We have to understand what's more reasonable or not reasonable. I'm open to the debate. But the idea that it's just like perfectly reasonable for a Supreme Court justice to hang an upside down flag
The
in
wife.
response to a neighbor's fuck Trump sign,
His wife,
and
not
that
him.
has
The wife.
okay, again, you're assuming that that's true. You have no evidence to
That's
back it
what
up.
he
You
no,
said.
hold on.
for it.
Hold on.
What the
Oh, you're
neighbor-
The
right. We should
evidence
just
we
take his
have
word for
is
it.
that he said this. Do you have evidence otherwise to
No,
call
but
that into question?
Wick, my whole
News
point.
reporting says this.
Wick, my whole point is that it does not even necessarily matter if it was his wife or him. Now, what I'm pointing out is that you guys are all, we gotta have evidence. There's no evidence his wife or him didn't do it. That's my whole point.
Yes,
It
I
just
believe we need
appears.
evidence before.
Yeah, so
It is
we're the evidence
No.
team over here. Yeah.
Okay, let's say Alito said that somebody just came onto his lawn and just like hung the flag against his. We didn't know it was hung. Just some random bystander hung a flag. We can say anything to excuse something happening on the property of someone else, right? Now we don't have a camera. We don't know who hung it. We don't know who took it down. My point is that the appearance
have
of
corroboration,
impropriety. The appearances of impropriety is something worth taking very seriously. And so the idea that I'm saying fundamentally is, does it call into question his impropriety? Yeah, I think it does. I think it's reasonable to make that statement, right? I don't think it's reasonable to take his word for it, because we wouldn't take the word of a prosecutor who says I could prosecute my own brother.
No, but we
wouldn't take his word for it.
would take the word of a prosecutor if, when it comes to, like, again, political issues and whether they affect his job. So when it comes to a DA who personally believes that marijuana should be legal, but he decides to, prosecute someone who's selling weed. Like, we're not going to say, well, you can't sell weed or you can't prosecute someone who sells weed because you personally might want, like, the legalization of
No, that
weed.
prosecutor wouldn't take the case.
No, that's not true. Prosecutors are assigned cases by the DA. They have to take whatever.
Refuse to prosecute marijuana all the time. That's what happens in
No,
so many
no,
local
no,
areas.
not prosecutors. That can come down to the direction of the DA, who's elected, by the way, usually. And
Hey,
so the
can I-
DA is going to direct the prosecutors on what sort of policy. If a DA
Well,
tells a prosecutor,
wait,
hold on, no,
wait,
no,
I
no,
wanna
you're
clarify-
factually.
wait,
Stop saying wait. I'm in the middle. This is important.
Can you
A pro-
clarify?
Well, can I clarify the difference? Okay, a prosecutor works for the DA. Okay, the district attorney.
No. I'm sorry. I'm going to ask you to clarify between a judge and a prosecutor in terms of the ethics.
No.
standard.
Econo Boy brought up the prosecutor
Yeah.
example. I'm simply addressing that, right? So what I'm saying is, in his example, it would not be. It's not the same thing here as, like, his brother, right? It would be much more comparable to say that actually the most comparable thing would be like a prosecutor's wife is in favor of legalizing marijuana. So can he prosecute weed dealers?
So I would
Obviously,
assume,
yes.
I don't know.
I would assume that really quick, I would assume that if you were able to, because there would have to be some sort of investigation, right? All we have is, like, reasonably so, could we question these things? Obviously, I would say that we've established that at the very least. Like, at least I would say it's worth questioning. However, I would say that if we were to go through this chain of investigation and prove that a prosecutor has these, views on marijuana legalization and this and that, but they were assigned cases by, like, an anti-marijuana district attorney, and then we were able to show, like, this person was torpedoing the prosecution of these people because of their political beliefs, I think typically we would say
Yeah,
that's
if you could show that.
So hold on.
If you could show that.
us in Alito's reasonings that he has made, show us where he has
Thank
done
you,
that,
Wick.
and I will take you seriously.
Okay, so as I've said before, all
can't
that I'm
show it.
saying isn't no Lactoid. I feel like you guys are being completely fucking idiotic on purpose. Like, I'm not saying that Alito is perfectly, absolutely the case, a completely biased, partisan piece of shit. Again, what you guys have refused to engage with this entire discussion is the idea that the appearance of corruption is something that is bad in and of itself, whether or not there's actually corruption taking place. That is
But
my whole
that's
overarching
self-evident.
point.
reasonable appearance. The reasonable thing is a word you keep leaving out, because I can believe someone is corrupt with no evidence because the voices told me. That would not be reasonable. What we are saying
we
is that it
disagree
is
on
not
whether it's reasonable.
reasonable.
Right.
And again, you have yet to convince us that
I'm not sure I'm able to do that.
Yeah, no, I don't think.
Raising a flag. Like, look, if you have evidence, right? If you showed us something, some statement he has made, some ruling he has made, which would corroborate your narrative that you're painting, that he has this appearance of corruption, that we can't trust him to rule fairly in these cases, I'm open to it. I'm asking for it.
Okay.
But as of now, you have yet to provide it.
Lactoid.
Here's the thing. I want to jump back in here on this, and that's make a couple of points. I think
Yep.
Boy is harping on appearances because that's where you get to exercise the most imagination and license to fabricate, invent, and engage in innuendo, right? Which is what precisely he's doing by, again, overlooking the fact that the neighbors have stipulated. The news reporting is pretty clear on the events that happened. Okay,
Well,
there
the
isn't
neighbors, the
a
news
lack of
reporting
information here.
stipulated. Wait, hang on. To
Okay.
clarify, unless you have something to the contrary, my understanding is the reporting is stipulated that there was a dispute between Mrs. Alito and the neighbors, but nobody, to my knowledge, has confirmed who put the flag up.
So okay, so one, we know that there was a dispute. We understand the Alito's household. Both of them are saying that Mrs. Alito put it up as a response to that dispute. Now we don't have anything else to go on. So therefore,
corroborate,
you
yeah.
guys though are taking too much credit and saying, well, look, in the absence of a corroboration that Mrs. Alito put the flag up, we will conclude that Samuel Alito did.
Wait a
That's
minute.
just
One more thing.
that's an intellectual step too far.
That's
No,
not
No,
what
wait,
I
well,
said.
to be fair to
with
them,
respect, yeah.
I've
yeah, to
never
be
said
fair to
that.
them, what they're saying is he might have, and we don't know. But my contention with that is he might have beaten his wife.
Well,
We don't know,
also, that's not
right?
even
So
Right, and
if
that's why they
we
harp
can
on
that's
the
just
not even.
appearance.
assume
So
and make,
wait a minute.
you
So
know,
again, I appreciate that you were trying to be fair to us, but you weren't quite, because no, we don't know who put the flag up, and our position is even if it wasn't Alito, he should have taken the fucking flag down. That's our position.
How do you wait? Hold on. How do you know he didn't?
You're right.
How
He
do
may
I?
have. He
Oh,
may have after days.
if he didn't
After
take the flag
days.
down,
And
you're
then
Yes,
saying?
secondly,
after
Boy,
days. So wait a minute.
so
So lactoid. But
go
my
ahead.
position is that wouldn't matter if he left it up for days. If the second he saw that thing, he should have taken it down. So unless your proposition is that in his own house he had no idea that there was a flag outside for a matter of days.
He could have been gone, couldn't he? He could
yeah,
have been gone for a
I
couple
don't
days.
even
you
I
know
don't
what?
know.
even
You know
at his
what?
house,
That's
to be
cool because
honest
we can
with
do
you.
this all day. Because at the end of the day, nowhere do I have to prove shit. I just have to.
If you want him to
reasonably
recuse himself, you got to
question.
prove shit.
I have to. He's not going,
Yeah.
buddy. There's no way to force Samuel Alito.
No, I'm not saying. I know.
Wait a minute.
I'm
Let's be
saying if
clear.
you want him to.
Can we just stipulate this, Lactoid? If I had video fucking evidence of Alito in a Trump, like he's decked out like a NASCAR driver sponsored by MAGA, flying that
Yes, if you
fucking
have that
flag up.
video
Wait a
evidence, I
minute.
would say you'd have a much
Could
stronger argument.
Alito be forced to recuse himself?
Alito could not be forced to recuse himself, but
Thank
that
you.
wasn't my
Okay.
statement. My statement is
I understand.
my statement is if you want him to recuse himself,
I want. I
even that
know-
okay okay sure I understand like kind of meme of like I want all conservative justice, but I'm saying like if on any kind of principled basis for the arguments you've been making, if you want a justice to recuse himself, you have to have more at the very least than this. And this is a standard that I think both myself and Wick would apply to any justice, whether it be
Bro.
regardless of what political aisle. But
Fuck
you guys,
you.
yeah,
No.
I'll prove it
repeatedly.
right now. Right, Wick said that he wants Ginsburg. He did not think that Ginsburg should have had to recuse herself. I don't
Absolutely
even
not.
think
That would
that.
be ridiculous.
I don't even think so. So me and Wick are actually being very consistent on this. Let me ask you:
Why would
do
you-
should
why would you
should
have-
Ginsburg have recused herself for
He
all
did
of her
say
cases
yes.
on
He
Trump?
did say
Okay,
yes. He
Econo
did
Boy,
say
what
yes.
about you?
Yeah, I would take a slightly more nuanced opinion. I would say that when it comes to Ginsburg, because I know that there are specific circumstances where the Supreme Court can actually directly hear criminal cases. For instance, if the Supreme Court were to take over a criminal trial of Donald Trump, and you've got a history of a liberal justice making statements against personally that defendant in this case, well, obviously anybody who does that should recuse themselves. The issue I think that I'm having with the appearance of corruption with Alito, and I've made this clear throughout the debate, is that it has to do with a contemporary topical political issue, right? And I think that there's a difference between like Ginsburg, for instance, ruling on, the Trump administration's immigration policy is illegal for this. And well, I had one more sentence. Is illegal for this and that reason. Oh, well, this person has a history of personally disliking Donald Trump. I think that there's a lot of degrees of separation there. I think it's a little bit different.
But in the Ginsburg case, right, we have evidence that she had made statements regarding how she thought it was crazy. I forget the exact wording. We can look it up,
Mhm.
right? But that it
Yeah.
was just totally improper that he hadn't yet released his tax returns. And then
Mhm.
contemporaneously, she
Yeah.
ruled on a case involving his tax returns.
If she
Ooh.
said publicly, well, it's not an own because I'm not familiar with this, but if she said publicly that she thinks personally it should be the case
Your
that
ignorance
Donald
will
Trump should
not save
release
you
his
on this. But
well,
go on.
I'm not relying on it saving me because I'm going to take a principled position and say that if Ginsburg had publicly said, I believe it should be the case before hearing the evidence of the court case that Donald Trump should release his taxes, well, yeah, she should have recused herself from that case. That doesn't sound proper to me.
I just disagree. I just disagree on a principled level. I think that,
Okay, well, don't
again,
say that I'm not principled, then
justices.
it's ridiculous.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that justices should have the ability to have personal opinions, but what they should do is set those aside when making rulings. And I believe, because I can do it, I think everyone can do it, right? That we can set aside our personal biases and make an objective ruling based on the facts presented to us.
Wick,
We ask jurors to do this. We ask people to do this all the time, right? I don't think that it is un it is
do you know
not.
what goes through the process, like voir dire and the rigorous process of jury selection? We don't just pick like 5 fucking or 9, 12 people, however many
What
it
do
is.
you think the process is for selecting a Supreme Court fucking justice? Do you think
The
it's more
Heritage
rigorous or
Foundation
less
comes up
rigorous
with a
than a
list.
juror?
The Heritage Foundation comes
It's
up with
not
a
the
list.
Heritage Foundation. It's the Federalist
The
Society.
Federal
Federalist
Society. Fuck,
Society.
sorry. The
And the
Federal
Democrats
Society.
spend their time asking nominees to
Buddy,
explicitly state their views on specific, not just issues, but cases. So yes, we
yes,
understand what the
every
nominations process looks like.
there is a partisan process, of course, for both sides when it comes to selecting judges and justices. There's no question
Well,
about
So
that.
and
nominations
with
is a
regards to the
political
comparison
process.
to a
Yeah.
jury,
Yes,
if we're talking
100%.
about juries, I think if I'm not mistaken, and Lactoid, you're the lawyer here, so please correct us if we're wrong. I believe it's pretty ordinary for a jury selection process. For instance, if it were to include like the Donald Trump trials, I think it's pretty ordinary to ask people who are on a jury selection panel their political opinions, and for prosecutors and or I don't know what the phraseology would be, prosecutors and the defendants' attorneys, I guess, to strike potential jurors
Yeah, it's voir
based on
dire
their
and
expressed
challenges.
political opinions, right? So I mean, that doesn't seem like an unusual
The
process or expectation.
questions, the
And also,
questions
hang on, can
usually.
I just throw this one thing into? Aren't there also, Lactoid can answer this too?
And we
Aren't
do
there
have
also
another caller, so I want to
consequences
cycle.
for
So.
jurors who commit perjury, like during the selection process?
Like if you were to say,
Perjury if they're under oath. Yeah.
yeah, like
Aren't
if
they're
somebody
under
gets
oath
asked
during
like,
voir dire and stuff like that?
how do
Yeah,
you feel
they're
about
under.
marijuana legalization? And you say, I actually, I don't feel strongly about it, but then it's proven that you actually do feel strongly about it based on your social media posts. You could be in trouble for perjury in that circumstance.
Right?
Potentially, how do you feel about something is particularly difficult because opinions can change, right? Like,
Would you
oh,
concede that?
I did feel bad
I
about,
understand.
I was against marijuana legalization, but at the time of the question that you asked me, I actually very much was in favor of marijuana legalization.
Fair enough.
That's why it'd be a bad
Would you at
question.
least concede in good faith that there are more rigorous checks in jury selection than in a Supreme Court? Like there's as we talked about, there's no remedy. There's none.
Not necessarily, right? So a lot of the questions that are asked are things like, do you have these beliefs that you can't set aside, or like that you would not be able to ignore when coming to this decision, or coming to a decision, or that you wouldn't be able to, like, et cetera, et cetera. That's usually how the question is asked, and the reason being is, like, everybody has an opinion about everything, right? And the question is not about, we got to find a human being that for some reason doesn't have opinions. I mean, you guys are the ones that whole time have been saying that human beings are not automatons,
No, they're not.
which we agree
Correct.
with, right? You're never going to find
Right.
somebody who doesn't have opinions. The question is just like, are you able to set aside your opinions when it comes to ruling? So yes, you can have jurors who are personally in favor of weed legalization, who are on a jury prosecuting a drug dealer, a weed dealer. And at the end,
No.
like the jury instructions almost always state, this is not about your personal opinion. This is not about your thoughts on greater society. This is just about
Sure.
the evidence you have heard in this case.
I'm just going to say
think-
where I think this falls apart is, again, there's a voir dire process. Both sides can challenge juries or potential jurors. The jurors themselves are not asked one question. They are usually asked multiple questions in the process. There is another check in the form of the judge, which issues instructions. and there has to be the unanimity of a verdict, right? So all of these things, I would just argue as a general proposition, create much greater checks against biases than what's available for a Supreme Court justice, and I think you would agree with that too.
Okay, I'm
Real
going
quick, Wick,
to
one
cycle.
last thought to
Well, I
leave with here is
quickly.
real quick. Yeah, is that look, Accountable Boy made a point about the flying the American flag upside down. I don't think in any part of our history that flying the American flag upside down has been viewed as a symbol of support for insurrection, overthrowing the government. Otherwise, it's used as a signal of distress and extreme danger. Okay, so if we're going to I think it's a giant intellectual leap to go from Alito's wife flying a flag upside down as part of a dispute with neighbors
Days after an insurrection in a dispute
to
with an
an
anti-Trumper.
to
You're leaving that
Alito
part out.
displaying
Hold
some
on. How many of those
impropriety.
January Sixers had wallets? I
Uh,
bet you she had a wallet
Oh,
too. Oh my
right.
God,
Not even,
this
not
is
just right.
crazy.
But aside for a
Wow, they
moment that we
must be
have
the
to
same.
believe, right, that the American flag now is a symbol of version and insurrection because there were a bunch of American flags toted around by people on January 6th.
oh
This
man.
is ludicrous and it requires a huge, massive leap of imagination to reach an impropriety by Alito. So thanks for having me on,
Okay,
Wick. Have a
thank
good
you,
one.
and we'll bring on the next one.
Alrighty. Good
Okay.
talking.
What about the
Good
wallet,
talking.
Wick, while you're bringing on the next one? Can you
Again,
clarify
just
that?
because you have groups that fly a
January Sixers
symbol
drank water.
doesn't mean, right, that everyone who flies that symbol necessarily has those same beliefs. For example, if a KKK member held a sign up about climate change, right? Like we need to fix climate change now. We need to solve climate change now. Would that
Yeah.
suddenly mean that everyone else who's
Well,
ever
we
flown a symbol
If the
regarding climate
person,
change was a
y-
KKK member?
you know what?
Absolutely not.
If there was a high profile event of, I mean, I don't think that's an example because Dan, we're talking about
Okay, I'm just
inverted
gonna
flag.
let you know.
Wait a minute. So you're not talking about the American flag. You're not talking about something nearly as ubiquitous. You're talking about an inverted flag, which is a sign of distress. So that's point one. Point two, days after the insurrection in which the inverted flag was carried. Number three, the person in question was in a dispute with another person, and what pissed her off to fly that flag was the guy said "fuck Trump" on a yard sign. Come on,
3
man,
months
that's
ago
beyond just a little.
3 months ago, I'm a pretty politically involved person, and maybe this is a knock against me because I'm ignorant, but 3 months ago, if you asked me, "Hey, was an upside down flag the symbol of insurrection in America?" I'd been like, "Well, no, I'd never heard of that before," because again, it wasn't this ubiquitous symbol on January
That's why I
6th.
said
It
it
was
wasn't
something that was flown
ubiquitous.
3 times.
I agree. It takes a very specific subset of knowledge to fly it in that context. That's my
So
point.
again, we're doing this mind reading when we assume that Justice Alito's wife was meant to signal that on that occasion. Because
Yes,
again, I was watching the
well,
reporting.
well,
That
wait.
wasn't something that was reported on widely. That
Yeah.
wasn't a big focus of the January 6th incidents. Like you'd have to
Well,
like
like you've conceded, you have to do mind reading too, because Josiah's example of Trump, or not of Trump, of Alito being in the NASCAR-esque, Trump flag, situation, that requires mind reading. Oh, well, maybe that's just the most comfortable outfit he could have,
Yeah,
worn
your
that day.
standard wick
far
would
more
allow a
evidence.
guy to sit down covered in Trump paraphernalia, holding up a sign saying, "I'm going to vote for Trump in this case," and it
Like
would
it's
still
it's
be
always
mind reading.
ultimately going to be speculative, right? Is what
Yeah,
we're saying, right? So
you
it's just a
know
different
that's true.
standard by which
That's
we would
but
evaluate
that's
these things.
silly. That's
It's
ridiculous.
silly
I
for you to use
agree.
the wallet
To
example
use
and you
these
use it. We can go both ways with this.
No, we cannot. One is not the same as the other. These are not analogous, right?
All right,
In one
Dwub
case, we
Winkle.
have far less evidence. It's far more opaque. And the other is pretty clear.
Okay, let
We
me ask you this
disagree.
then.
We disagree.
In order to demand Alito's recusal, do I have to have a signed confession or mind reading powers?
Of course not.
I just need to have more evidence than what I do now.
Yes, to a
Okay.
substantive degree. I
Okay.
can't
All
give
right.
you a
The
exact
evidence you
line,
guys have
but
right
much
now is
like in
comical.
pornography, I'll know it when I see it, right? But we have a caller. Let's get to the caller. I
Let's
don't mean
do
to
it.
talk
Let's
over you.
do it.
Friend, hello, welcome. What are your thoughts? You're live.
Well, I didn't want to derail. Lactoid actually brought up kind of where I was thinking with this. Um, would it be reasonable to believe that there is a single Supreme Court justice that has no opinion on whether January 6th was an insurrection, or whether it was a patriotic act or whatever. Do we actually believe?
Yes, that would be unreasonable to expect that any of them don't have an opinion
Okay.
on that topic.
And so, considering we know that they're all going to have opinions, and we know that some of them have voiced opinions, even if we take the flag as Alito hung it and he did it because he thought that there was a chance that the election was stolen. Okay? We have statements from Justice Jackson, who characterized the January 6th with the statement, "Many of the attendees of this rally were lured to the Capitol building itself. They participated in what many scholars and commenters have characterized as an armed insurrection. If there's a more serious offense in terms of who we are as a society and the democratic order that is at the core of our constitutional scheme, I don't know what is." Okay? To me,
Were you quoting
seems
somebody,
like,
or was I'm sorry, guys, I want to make sure
Yes,
I'm
yes,
Justice
that was
Jackson
me
said this
quoting
in the wake
Justice
of
Jackson from
January 6th.
I believe it was a 2021 case for one of the rioters. Um,
Well, I mean,
so
I think that
so
there's a
where I'm
difference
going with
between you're
this,
quoting from one of her judicial opinions. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with establishing a judicial opinion and then using that same
No,
judicial
let
opinion as a.
I'm just curious if
one
he'll
of-
trip into his own gotcha. Just keep
Yeah, I'm
going.
confused. Okay.
No, keep
so
going,
for it.
buddy. Sorry. Keep going.
so she has voiced. It seems pretty clear to me that with this upcoming case, she at least has some very strong feelings about it, just as Justice Alito's family certainly does. Okay? If we think all of the justices likely have opinions on this, probably strong opinions considering
Sure.
their entire career has
Mm-hmm.
been focused on law and order of this nation, right? I feel like the bar or recusal should have something more than voicing some of the opinions that they've had in the past on this issue that could tangentially color their personal views.
Okay, we gotta let him respond to that, and then we have some more people waiting. We gotta get to them too. But go ahead, respond, gang.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm not sure if the reason I would say that they're not quite analogous is because if Justice Jackson, as part of a legal framework that she established, was making comments on the nature of the January 6th riots as a part of a judicial opinion she was writing in her capacity as a justice, I'm not sure that I would. I'm not sure I would view these. I'm not sure I would view that as like a personal act of partisanship, right? For instance, Alito, he has signaled, for instance, like conservative justices have signaled that, oh yeah, basically, if we were to hear gay marriage again, we'd vote against that shit. Right, right. And to be fair, it's because Justice Alito and Thomas have already voted against it, right? Now, I guess maybe could you say that this is improper because technically any gay marriage case would be a new case and there might be different reasons for it? Like maybe, I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't say you should recuse yourself because of using a past judicial framework that you've established. Now, um, in general, I think we're going to kind of circle the drain on this. I don't want to repeat myself. Yeah, I would just say that in general, it's worth questioning somebody's true, like, unbiased nature. I would agree that everyone has partisanship and everyone has opinions on things. But again, if we care about the institutional support of this, I think that it's important that people view Supreme Court justices as generally nonpartisan actors. For instance, I think it was, I can't recall if it was Justice Jackson or a previous justice who was up for confirmation. I wouldn't be surprised if a conservative justice said this. But they said something along the lines of, it's important to understand that justices aren't unbiased. They all have their biases. In fact, it's very important to understand those biases to try and get around them or to try and forcefully deal with them as best you can. And I would say something similar, that part of doing that is not making openly partisan and polarizing statements or doing openly partisan and polarizing acts, right? And where we disagree is hanging an upside down flag in the wake of January 6th an openly partisan polarizing act.
Is your wife doing it? To be
Well,
clear.
again, is your household having this or whatever?
what
Is that an openly partisan
my
polarizing act that would
was not on that.
reasonably call into question somebody's impropriety? I would say yes. You guys disagree, and that's just kind of where
Okay.
I don't know.
Quick
Is
that's where we have to
retort,
leave
and
it.
then we're gonna
saying,
cycle.
though.
Quick retort.
I said
I would like to
it
retort as
is-
well.
If he did it, it's clearly an openly partisan statement. It just is. Now,
Okay.
if
Yeah.
we know that they are all partisan, they all have partisan beliefs, then
Mhm.
to me, the idea that we can reasonably say they would act with impropriety due to their partisan beliefs cannot merely be an expression of those beliefs. If we know they all have them, then
What would an
Okay.
example of them
Sure.
engaging with I actually
there
want
is
to explore this a bit.
evidence that they would act
What would
for
that
those
look like?
partisan beliefs.
What would that look like? Because we just had, let's skip to the end here, because what you're saying, it sounds like to me you're trying to give license to Supreme Court justices to be as partisan as possible by saying they're all partisan. This person in a previous judicial ruling expressed views which you could construe as partisan. Therefore, we shouldn't try to enforce the veneer of impartiality. And if that's the case, if that's the trajectory you want to take this, then so be it. In which case, it goes back to what Conaboy and I are arguing, which is treat the Supreme Court like a political institution. Otherwise, if we're not going to, with term limits, elections, changing composition, mandatory retirement ages, various compositions of checks that we impose on the political branches, then they can't behave like the political branches. They have to keep their fucking biases to them. They have to wake up every morning and think, how can I convince the majority of Americans that I don't have the partisan beliefs that I have? That, in a nutshell, should be the ethic that guides them. Otherwise, if they're just politicians in robes, then they should have term limits, elections, changes in composition, and all this other shit.
You think making them directly elected would reduce the partisanship? You think they're going to be waking up
No.
and thinking,
Of
hold on. You think they're going to be waking up and thinking, how do I reduce my perception of partisanship, as opposed to directly campaigning to like the
You
majority of
completely
voters,
emphasize points like
specifically like,
unbelievable.
oh, I'm going to rule in your favor. So you like, look, if you want gay marriage back, or if you want abortion back, vote for me. Of course they're going to be doing this. Like that
No, but
is
that's
like the fastest way to hell, right? If you're
what's
gonna
you
the
missed
if you're
his point completely.
no, no, no.
His point was
I
that
have
they're gonna.
not. I have not missed the point. What he's saying is that if they're going to behave this way, then they have to have these things. What I'm saying is, like, if you implement these things, any like concept of the court being nonpartisan is gone. You're saying that, like, surely you think that the court is at least a little bit less partisan than Congress, right? Where they go up on stage and they rant about like the most partisan shit ever. Like, here, if you really believe that the U.S. Supreme Court is as partisan as Congress is,
if what?
Josiah, if
Are
the
you
U.S.
saying do you?
Do you think that the
Oh,
U.S. Supreme Court is as partisan as the U.S. Congress?
I don't think that they are as openly partisan. No.
Okay, so if you made them directly elected, you would probably get them closer to being openly as partisan, right?
Lactoid. So I gave you a list of things that we can impose on them, and I said a
I answer,
combination thereof.
I know I
So
asked a direct
so wait a
question.
minute. So wait a minute. So wait. So yes, I think you have exposed a potential flaw with direct elections.
Great, thank you.
Although I'm not. Wait a minute. No, because you know what I'm going to hit you back with.
Hit me, do it.
What happens I don't know if it's
Hit me
49
like you
out of
wanted
50
Alito to
states.
hit his wife about.
I don't
Like,
know
go
if
ahead.
it's 49 out of 50 states, Lactoid, but do states in this country which have the same structure that we do on the federal level, three branches of government, do states here in the United States elect their Supreme Court justices?
Yeah, and it sucks. They shouldn't do that.
Okay, so are you saying that we can't trust the rulings of those elected officials in that capacity?
I think trust is a gradient. We could trust them more if they weren't directly elected.
Okay, but my point is, other laboratories of democracy here in this country do the elections, so the idea that it's out of the question sounds ridiculous to me. But I think
But it's worse. Of course they do it.
I think
North Korea does
you,
shit too, you know. Oh shit, I got.
Okay, I do want to get to the other callers. I'm sorry. I hate
Can
to
this guy
skip it.
clarify though? Like, can he just because I asked him a question before Lactoid was a dick,
Sure.
which is what he usually does.
Wick
but
is gonna fucking strangle you, Josiah. If he ever sees you in real life, he's gonna
Well,
kick
no,
your ass.
Lactoid and
We
I have a
hung
love-hate
out. We broken
relationship.
bread,
Like I am
brother.
trying to get to the next caller, Josiah.
Lactoid and
God
I. Oh,
damn
I
it.
thought you said Wick. I'm sorry. Yeah, Wick, and I definitely have that too. But can this guy clarify? What do you think the standard should be in terms of biases, sir? What do you think it should be? Are you suggesting that justices should be allowed to be as partisan as other politicians?
In the way that they behave, no. They
Okay.
should not be as openly partisan, and their rulings should reflect the judicial philosophy that they at least claim to have. Every Supreme Court justice, to my knowledge, that's on the bench right now has and likely will continue to rule against what they would personally wish. And that's what we should expect from our judges. It does not appear to me that we have judges on the bench that overwhelmingly make their decisions based off of their own partisan interests. When we have reason to believe that's not the case, I'm fine impeaching judges.
What would that look like? That's my last question. What would it look?
Well, originalist judges actually have a pretty clear judicial philosophy that they lay out. It is testable. You can
No. So, okay, this is where
that
okay, I'll stop you there, and
Okay,
then we
we're
can go on to the next
we're
caller.
gonna get
We can
into
go
it.
on to the next caller because even Lactoid conceded that a sufficiently skilled originalist could cherry pick to a preferred outcome. So no, fuck that. Sorry, go on.
Well, not even if sufficiently skilled. I mean, you can have scientists do bad
what I was
science.
saying.
Yeah, this idea that well, originalism is such a well-founded philosophy
They
that
are
listen.
and they are repeatedly being and their rulings repeatedly go against what we would expect originalists to say. Yes, either by cherry picking cases. And it seems like every single time they are taking bad actions when forming their arguments, it just so happens to line up with their personal politics.
Gotcha.
That is very strong evidence that they are not doing their job as a justice
Okay,
properly.
we
We would
gotta
we would
move
never
on.
know. We would
We
never know
got
that.
we
Yeah.
got
Okay, I
both of you.
just wanted to
Thanks,
No,
buddy.
no.
Well, let's talk sometime. DM me because I want to hear more of what you have to say.
But for now, we gotta move on because I gotta eat and I gotta take care of my dog.
Why don't you ever eat before these things? Fuck your
Man,
diet.
look, I have a schedule. I'm old, okay, brother.
This is
I
my one
need
night, by the way,
routine.
to myself. So like, I wanna,
I
like, I
know, and
wanna, like,
I appreciate you
Lactoid,
spending it with
Econoboy, are
me.
you guys
This
gonna be
is too
staying
long.
after this?
Yeah, I'm doing
I
good.
have a hard stop. I'm getting the motorcycle delivered in about like 7 minutes ish.
Okay. Cameraman, what do you got for us? Be concise, please.
Sure thing. First, I wanted to address Lactoid. McGirt didn't say that there's an ethnostate. As someone who was in Oklahoma as a prosecutor, it's just Indian country and it only applies to Indians.
How do you become a citizen of those Indian tribes?
You have to be on the Dawes rolls.
Do you have to have a certain blood quantum in order to be a member of those tribes?
For Cherokee and Creek, I believe you just have to be on the rolls.
Okay, so I've looked into this.
Or your ancestor has to be on the rolls.
Right. My understanding is that for all or at the very, I'm going to leave some room for my own mistake here. At least most of the tribes that currently inhabit Oklahoma in the area that was expanded, they go by blood quantum, which is how most Native American tribes in the U.S. base it off of. Which means that if you don't have a sufficient blood quantum percentage, you don't get to be a citizen.
Blood
Okay,
Quantum is a great name for a band. Just FYI.
Huh?
Blood Quantum
that's
is a
a good
great name
point.
for a band.
Yeah. That's what I was referring to. I think that
I don't know anything
citizenship
about
being based on blood quantum, that's bad, like really bad. And I think that any kind of political organization that bases citizenship off blood quantum needs to just be abolished.
To be fair, it's not citizenship. It is if you have any connection. But regardless, pondering, you mentioned
Sorry.
2 cases that you said give evidence to Alito being biased. What were the 2 again? They were the
The
Pennsylvania,
ones that
Texas.
the ones that I recall, and it wasn't even a case. I think he just dissented when they refused to grant cert, right? Or they refused to review the case for
Right.
for Trump's challenging the Pennsylvania election results. And then the one that I don't know if he actually voted against or dissented from was the January 6th like text message case when they were trying to get the text message from alleged conspirators and the insurrection. I know Thomas dissented, but I don't know where Alito was on that. That was just shit off the top of my head. That's why I was non-committal.
Wasn't the reasoning for the Texas Pennsylvania is because it's an original jurisdiction case for Supreme Court? That's what their reasoning was.
Well, I think that was one of the things he cited, or one of the well, I don't even know if he cited it. I know that was the case for conservatives trying to bring the case because it was a dispute between two states, and I think the majority decided against it because they thought that there was no standing.
Right, but if it was the reasoning being for their dissent is that it was an original jurisdiction. That seems to be a pretty reasonable grounds to say we should be granting jurisdiction. Also, since they wouldn't grant relief for like an injunction, that seems to say they're saying we need to see this case, but we're not gonna. I don't think there's a high likelihood of success.
So your position is then that there was a perfectly principled stance for Alito to want to review the case.
Yes.
Okay.
And
Out of curiosity, because at this point it's a counterfactual,
I-
how do you think he would have ruled in that case?
I think he would have ruled that I recall the issue standing or that the Pennsylvania had gone around around their own laws when they
Hmm.
made a decision. I would think he would have said that the Supreme Court of the Pennsylvania had the higher authority on that decision.
Okay.
So he
Well-
would have ultimately ruled against Trump on that.
Yes, and I think the fact that he wasn't willing to grant injunction relief to Texas is evidence of that.
Okay. How do you think, again, out of curiosity, how do you think he'll
We
rule on
do
the
got to
immunity
move
case?
along.
On the what?
On the immunity case, because we're waiting on that ruling.
If I had to guess, I would say that he's going to say that presidents have a blanket immunity on specific things that are under their power. For all other aspects, it would be a qualified immunity.
Interesting. Why don't you DM me too? Because I know you were pretty opinionated in chat, and I didn't get a chance to address them all. I'd love to have a conversation with you.
Absolutely.
All
Beautiful.
right.
Hey,
And
thanks
send me
for
a friend
calling in.
request too, please.
And thanks for the super chats, buddy. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Love you too.
Did you just say love me too? Oh, fair enough.
I thought he said he might be a
said it.
Destiny fan because Destiny
Huh.
typically says "I love you."
Okay.
He's also thinking, what is Lactoid going to say to Josiah when Lactoid leaves?
Hello?
What is that gonna be? Hello, you're live. Make it
Oh my
quick.
goodness. Oh
You're
my
the
goodness.
last
Of
caller.
course.
Last
Yes,
caller.
I have a quick question. Earlier when we were talking about that hypothetical with bringing slavery back to the United States, Lactoid's response was that if the reasoning was good, he would have to view the reasoning. I'm sure we all agree there is no good reasoning for slavery, but we'd have to see it. Now that led me to think about how a lot of people see the Supreme Court as like this priestly, like theological class that can just dictate, like as long as the theological justification is good, we can say like this is the law of the land. So I was wondering to you guys, because when I debate like neo-Confederates online, a lot of them argue like about unilateral right to succession and things like that. I have to explain to them White versus Texas and how that establishes it's illegal to do that and all that stuff. So, in your opinion, what does it mean when the Supreme Court makes a decision? Is that's it? All right, the debate is settled. Does your
No.
personal opinion change? Like, what does it mean to make a decision?
I disagree. So I'll go first, and I'll let Lactoid go. So I think that I disagree with Supreme Court decisions all the time, right? I think that sometimes they're badly reasoned, sometimes that they're badly ruled on. Again, not a lawyer, so I very much could be wrong, but there are things that just don't add up, don't pass the smell test. What is the solution to that? Two solutions. One, vote in representatives that will elect better justices. That's one. And two, try to change the laws that they are interpreting, because that's what justices do. They interpret the law and make rulings on what those interpretations mean, right? I think that we can change and adjust the law in such a way that would annul what the Supreme Court says is the current law, or change
I
their
also
ruling
want to raise
and
my hand.
reasoning. Lactoid.
Yeah,
Nope.
can I say this? I gotta go right after this statement.
Yeah. Lactoid.
So-
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
First.
So I'm glad that you pointed out White versus Texas. I agree with you. I cite that a lot too because that's the Supreme Court precedent. Now, when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, that is the law of the land, right? And
Right.
arguably, I think that this does lead the Supreme Court. Maybe I'm biased to be one of the most important branches for sure. Because they are the ones who interpret the Constitution. They are the body that's tasked with doing this, and what they say is the law. And a violation, I've said this before when it comes to immigration, Wickham might remember this. I actually was with Pisco on this, which is if Texas violates the Supreme Court order in that matter, they would be that would be insurrection against the U.S. Constitution. If you violate the any Supreme Court order, this is a violation of the Constitution. This is traitorous activity against America. There are certain things that may lead, not me, at least not on recording, that may lead somebody to violate their oath to America and become a traitor. Perhaps if America brought back slavery, that could be something. But it would still be traitorous because the Constitution sets forth the Supreme Court as the deciding body. The deciding body has decided. We all have to follow it. And if we don't, we're traitors. Maybe being a traitor is a preferable alternative, but it is being a traitor.
How do you square that with Roe v. Wade? Because you clearly don't appreciate that decision. I don't either. When I call myself a conservative, I didn't like it.
No. I do appreciate the decision in one way, which is when Roe v. Wade was decided, that was the law, and states could not ban abortion. And if any state banned abortion under Roe v. Wade, I think they'd be committing treason against the U.S., the Constitution.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
I disagree with the ruling, right? But the authority of the ruling is with the Supreme Court. I'm glad the Supreme Court overruled it.
So what do you mean when you say you disagree with it, though? Does that mean you have a if someone tells me reality is a certain way, I can't disagree with them, right? If they tell me that abortion is a woman's healthcare right, I'm just supposed to be no, you're wrong. You're a Supreme Court justice, and I'm Dylan.
Maybe an example could be I get in an accident and then I'm temporarily incapacitated, and a doctor makes decisions for me. The doctor has authority to make decisions, but let's say I'm a doctor too, and then I wake up and I'm looking at the decisions the doctor made. Oh, these are terrible decisions. Doesn't matter, right? In that case, the doctor has the authority to make the decisions, even if I disagree. And as a professional in the legal field, I will voice my disagreements in an academic way. I'll have arguments with people. This happens all the time in decision-making bodies, right? But at the end of the day, a decision has to be made, and when the Supreme Court votes that the Constitution's interpreted a certain way, that's what it is.
He doesn't get to talk.
So I guess to put a button on it again, and to me this goes back to the subjectivity of the law, which Econoboy was, I think, correctly emphasizing from the beginning. You are acknowledging that the Supreme Court is the final authority in terms of interpreting the Constitution, but again, not necessarily objectively correct. You are perfectly free to dispute their logic, to dispute the validity or soundness of their rulings, but you would never question the final authority behind them.
Well, so again, on camera, I would, never question the final authority.
Fair enough. I understand. So fair enough. So this, to me, where it gets interesting is because, again, the broader problem for me that I'm trying to wrap my head around is all of this in the context of the standard for justices, the accommodations we afford them, and overall notions of separations of powers and checks and balances. Again, put simply, the thing that I can't square with you, Lactoid, is how can you trust, you know, do you believe checks and balances is reciprocal among the three branches? Or that only the court can impose, that only the court can check and balance the other two branches, or does it work both ways?
Well, I think there are checks and balances. I think there's nuance into how those particular checks and balances work. I think that, again, there are checks in the court that operate in specific ways, but one of the powers of the court, and this is decided in Marbury versus Madison, is judicial review. They get to strike down federal statutes. They get to strike down the law. And if the Supreme Court decides that something is unconstitutional, yes, I can disagree with it. I can say it's based off bullshit, right? And I often do. And in my professional and personal opinion, sometimes I think it should be overturned, but I have to follow it, right? When your manager gives you a directive that you think is stupid, can you just ignore it?
No, you're right. But see, what's fascinating about that is you just described a top-down relationship. I'd reject the idea that the Supreme Court is the manager and Congress and the president are the employees taking orders.
Well, no.
Wait a minute. Wait. Hey, let the fucking lawyer. I want to fight with somebody on this. What am I missing?
I will.
What am I missing, Lactoid?
I think that. I don't know. I think that according to Marbury versus Madison, you're wrong. And this is the way the America works right now.
And
it's the way the Constitution.
No,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Just can you clarify? When you say I'm wrong, you're saying that that metaphor does apply. That the
but then,
Supreme Court is the law.
I have long said, look, I have said that I think that in the ways that I am most concerned about, I think the Supreme Court has the most power. There are other things that other like Congress has more power in that I think are potentially less important, right? But this is
Sure.
also partially because it's my profession. You know, I'm actually there are rules that apply to me that are dictated by the Supreme Court that don't apply to other people. Like there's more investment into the system. I've sworn an oath to the Constitution. There's
Yeah,
definitely like
understood.
a
Yeah.
difference there that may be informing kind of like my value judgment on this. But regardless of the value judgment, I mean, and you can talk to a lot of legal experts on this, and they're going to validate what I'm saying, which is that the power to declare a law unconstitutional with the Supreme that power
That's the
it
silver fucking bullet. Yeah.
it is immense, right? And if the
Yeah.
Supreme Court
And
declares,
injunction.
and it can issue injunction, like if the Supreme Court declares something, like that is the law, and we have to follow it. The reason why states can't ban gay marriage is because the Supreme Court said so, and that's it.
So what's funny is I agree and I don't. That's the thing. I in terms of the practical effect, I completely agree with you. What's funny is that's why I said like the three branches are not co-equal. I mean, even it's a canard. It's found nowhere in the Constitution. I think the founders made it abundantly clear that Congress was supposed to be first among equals. And in theory, even in this situation, in theory, Congress could. In theory, Congress could impeach and remove justices. Justices have no defense against that. They can't declare an impeachment unconstitutional. Congress can give them the finger. I mean, I don't know what the president can effectively do besides non-acquiescence, but you would say that's treasonous, right? Because the president's supposed to comply with Supreme Court rulings
Yes,
and enforce them, right?
yes.
So President Lincoln was traitorous during the Civil War when he defied, I think it was, I can't remember the name of the Chief Justice during the time of the war, but when he refused to reinstate habeas corpus, it was a Supreme Court ruling, and he defied the court.
If the Supreme
Um,
Court ordered him to do something and he didn't do it, that was a
yeah.
traitorous action. Yeah,
What about
I
the
will say though, the Confederates were, I think, very much traitors in that context.
Sure, no, I would never question that. I know that, but so with
I'm
all that in
glad
mind,
we're all having these brave stances, but we
with
do
all
have to go.
well, listen,
I really have to go
my
as well.
question is for both of you because the other guy said he was conservative.
No. I'm a liberal now, but Jan 6
Oh,
is
okay.
crazy.
Oh,
I'm not.
gotcha.
I'm not.
Destiny
I'm not
saved
liberal
him.
yet.
Destiny saved him from the alt right
Destiny,
The
pipeline.
now I'm a
debates
Wikipedia warrior.
matter. He was debated out of his position.
Are you
Go ahead.
also an attorney?
No, I'm a veteran.
Oh, okay. So you're a much better person than Lactoid for various reasons.
Well, I don't know about
True.
that.
No, but in all seriousness,
True.
but in all seriousness, what then
I gotta
are you
bounce,
not
guys. I'm so sorry.
sympathetic that the
you.
justices by Lactoid? Good luck with the
Bye-bye.
motorcycle.
Love you, Lactoid.
Good
Thanks, guys.
talking.
Wick, are you not then? If even Lactoid saying effectively the Supreme Court's the most powerful branch, do you agree that whatever it looks like, justices should be held to higher standards than anybody then?
Not necessarily. I think that if you want to argue that there should be more standards, absolutely, I agree. What they would be, we'd have to devils in the details, right? But I think that the fact that they share power, whereas the executive branch does not, and there is a single individual in the executive.
Thank you guys so much. I got to bounce. I'm going to rate on out into Wick TV. Love you guys, and catch you later. Oh, and thanks for all the bits and subs. Really appreciate it. As always, thank you.